I want to welcome you to the 120th Annual Conference of the State Good Roads Association. 119 years and 5 days ago, we had our first conference here in Spokane. It worked out, so we decided to come back. The problem at that time was not preservation and maintenance, which is the primary subject today. Everyone understood that they needed a road system, didn't really have one. And everyone understood that they were spending several months every year in mud, and that didn't work very well for us. So now, 119 years later, as we enter our 120th year of work on behalf of good roads in this state, we have a different situation. And I should probably say, since I don't know some of you, my name is Will Knedlik. I'm the new president of the organization as of last night. And our organization, over the last year, has been working on trying to raise our awareness of and understanding of the preservation and maintenance challenge that we face. And we now have something much different than the road system we had 119 years ago. The system of state roadways, city streets, and county roads is a $500 billion asset if you look at it in terms of true and fair market value. You can get much lower numbers if you look at the replacement value of just the roadway surface itself. But in many urbanized areas, the right-of-way for our system is as valuable as any asset you can build. And so this is a very valuable asset. And I want us to make sure that we do everything we can to take full advantage of today. So if any of you have not yet turned off your phone, I'd like you to take a moment to do so. And I'd like to thank the sponsoring organizations. We have Acme and Ms. Tim Welcher. Okay. And
Robert.
Oh, okay. I want to thank you. Okay. I want to thank you, also thank the Kemper Development Company, and Bob Dishu is here. The Inland Northwest AGC, Cheryl Stewart is here. And the Spokane Area Good Roads Association. Joe Tortorelli has been our conference organizer, and of course we also have Steve Robinson, its chair, and the Benton Franklin Walla Walla Good Roads Association has Leo Bowman here, and the East Side Transportation Association, which is kind of a misnomer because it means the east side of Lake Washington, is a co-sponsor, and Vic Bishop is here with us as well. Because a number of legislators are interested in this subject but are unable to make it here while they're campaigning for office, as well as many of their opponents are interested in this issue, we are taping these presentations today so they'll be available. It puts some limits on what we can do. If we're going to have questions, if we have time for questions in some of the sessions, then we'll need to get you to write them out and give them to me so that I can hear from the microphone that will accommodate the taping. So I do want to say just a couple of things before I introduce our first speaker. And the first thing that I think needs to be said forthrightly in the environment we live in now is that the preservation and maintenance challenges is not fake news. When WSGRTA Secretary Roger Moore says that he needs $1.1 billion per year and that he only receives $550 million of funding for the preservation and maintenance needs, that is not fake news. That is kind of bare bones reality. Indeed, while I applaud the candor of our current secretary in quantifying these numbers, my only real concern is that it may understate the challenge, because arguments can be made that we need the $1.1 billion yearly for preservation, and that the maintenance could add another $400 million or so a year to that. So we're talking very serious money. And the major, another major issue that just hasn't yet been tabled, at least not in public by WSGRTA, is the fact that this deficit in funding for preservation and maintenance did not start last year. It has gone on for years and years and even decades. And if you just take underfunding of preservation and maintenance by $500 million a year for a decade, you're looking at a $5 billion deficit over that decade, and it would be more. So we're talking very large numbers. And John Koster, on behalf of the County Road Administration Board, and Ashley Probert on behalf of the Transportation and Improvement Board, are going to identify needs at the county and city levels that are similar in size, if not in fact greater than the $500 million a year, $5 billion over the last decade kind of deficit. So we're really talking very substantial amounts of money. Now, that out of the way, I just want to say one last thing. There is some cognitive dissonance that comes up when we know these facts and the Secretary of Transportation has had the courage to step up and talk about these facts and quantify them. And at the same time, the department puts out press releases that tell us that the road system is getting better. There's certainly ways to measure improvements, and there have been improvements. But we need to understand that our organization, at least, is going to focus on the need. And we're going to try to help the public understand that whereas when you bring on major new highways, it does improve the quality of roadways overall. I mean, a project like the new 520 bridge coming across from Bellevue to Seattle makes a difference, but it doesn't resolve what you're seeing on the screen, what you're going to hear today, and what you will continue to see. So, that all said, we're really glad to have Stacy Coles to start our conversation with a focus on the perspective of a businessman as a motorist, because these are perspectives that in the bureaucratic bowels of our state often don't get the focus that they need. And when you consider that the gas tax at the state and federal level is pretty much all paid for by the motorists and business people, their perspective is important. And I just want to give an example from yesterday at the I-5 system partnership meeting in Seattle. Excellent meeting. WSGRTA has convened several of them in the last few months. But if you look at the roster of participants, almost every imaginable group that can be identified is a part of that partnership. But I can't identify anybody who represents the interest of the 6 million drivers who fund the whole damn thing. And so I think this perspective is extremely important. As you know better than I, since many of you are from Spokane, Mr. Colson graduated Yale, Columbia Business School, businessman, publisher, venture capitalist. I just want to report, in case you didn't notice, that Yale lost its first game on Saturday, Holy Cross. It was in overtime. The other team in the league won their game against San Diego, and the big game will be in Cambridge this year on November 17th. Tickets available at $82. So, your publisher of a great newspaper, Mr. Coles.
Well, thanks, Will, and thank you, everybody. Give me a second while somebody needs to maybe
Can you help him out?
Oh, wait, I'm getting it. There is a remote there. If you want it, please. I thought at the start, just for my purposes and other speakers, I'd get a show of hands for how many in the room are policymakers. Okay, how about implementers, either DOT or contractors? How about advocates? Okay, is there anybody I missed? Okay, great. Well, you know, I was a little surprised that Joe asked me to speak, and even more surprised that I said yes. So you'll just have to see where this goes. I thought I'd give you a little bit of my transportation background as a newspaper publisher and citizen of Spokane. We don't have as big a fleet as we once had at the Spokesman Review, but we do have some. We have a lot of contract newspaper carriers, 500, who do an awful lot of driving on the state's roads every morning. 22 million deliveries a year. They complain a lot about gas prices and potholes. I do read a lot of newspaper stories about roads, and I think you probably notice we do a lot of coverage of roads at the Spokesman Review because roads are the way government touches everybody's lives the most. I serve on the Good Roads Association of Spokane County, and so did my dad and his dad and his dad. So that's my, those are my qualifications, such as they are. So basically, I don't really have any survey information, or it's really pretty limited. So this is a lot of shoot from the hip. Here are my first observation. Citizens and newspaper carriers are intently concerned about road conditions if their commute is full of potholes. This is kind of an interesting thought because right now, Spokane is looking pretty good. And so I think a lot of people are feeling good about their roads. Of course, it's highly weather dependent. I did a little research. This is the number of negative pothole letters that ran in the Spokesman Review over the last 14 years. I can't believe we kept these statistics, but you can see generally the trend is pretty good, with the exception of the winter of 2007-2008, which, anybody remember that winter? Probably if you're in transportation, you do. I think it was the snowiest on record in Spokane anyway. So, you know, this is a tough thing to figure out, well, what's the perception of roads in the state? It's tough just in the city of Spokane or eastern Washington. Of course, when things go bad, you know you're going to get covered, and you know, I don't think we made friends with City Hall on this day. They actually keep really good records of the conditions of pavement in the city. We happened to discover that and went through and did a complete study of which neighborhoods were the worst. And of course, it's just a snapshot in time, and it all depends on where the pothole crew is, probably. So number two is, well, if your commute's full of traffic, you're going to feel like roads are in terrible condition too. I think this applies mostly on the west side, but certainly on the east side on I-90. We're seeing a lot of deterioration in commute times if you're coming from Coeur d'Alene, for example, or even if you're heading east to the valley. I occasionally have to make that commute, and that's not much fun if you hit it at the wrong time. Of course, accidents are another huge downer. If people run into lots of accidents, like on I-90, we seem to have a spate of fender benders every once in a while. That really dampens the mood about roads. You know, if a bridge collapses anywhere in the world, I think this affects people's attitudes too. I was amazed at how many people talked about the latest bridge in Italy, which was catastrophic, of course, but you know, we've had our own, the I-5 Skagit Bridge, which was a pretty stunning disaster. So I think that affects people's views. You know, otherwise, people just take roads for granted and, you know, everything's good. So what are the implications for us as policymakers and implementers? I think we get judged on our worst day, just like newspapers. It used to be if you had a bad experience, you told 10 people. Well, with social media and the speed at which news travels, that's more like 10,000 people. So small mistakes can turn into big events very rapidly. I guess the good news is people's memories are really short because they're inundated with all kinds of news. Nonetheless, I think this indicates there's a lot of volatility around making even small mistakes. So you definitely want to avoid the big mistakes. But I think it's really important to be consistent year to year, which I know is a policy goal, is everyone's goal around here. And I think it's really important that DOT and others capitalize on what we do right, or things we can control, like response when people complain, making sure roads are safe, taking good public input. That means writing down what people say, summarizing it, feeding it back to them. And I don't mean a survey of 10. I mean, if you get 1,000 complaints, you ought to be able to put those together in some kind of a meaningful representation. I think transparency is really, really important because that's how you build trust, especially at the newspaper. That's how we weather the storm when the mistakes happen. If you spend a lot of time listening, people know that when they complain, you'll listen, and that promotes more trust. Which gets me to, really, are we doing a good job? And this came out of the Gray Book, I believe, and this is the 10-year statewide pavement performance, where the goal is, 10%. I don't think that's good enough. And I see that we've hit that goal pretty consistently, but we're getting closer and closer to not hitting it, which I think is the reason for this meeting and why, we really have to start paying attention. In the newspaper world, the industry standard is 2.5 complaints per 1,000 deliveries. So that's nowhere close to 10%. Although, these days there are very few papers that hit that mark. We're probably closer to 6 complaints per 1,000. But I think, in this world when people complain very easily and can complain to lots of people at once, I think this number should probably be closer to 5%, and that's what we ought to really be shooting for. Okay, what's my next generalization? I think citizens are intently aware that we spend a lot of money on roads. There's a lot of research out there. For example, this is from the Tax Foundation. We're number 2 in terms of gas taxes nationwide. I think the critics seize on that a whole lot. We're also pretty expensive in terms of how much we spend per lane mile. This is a study that came out of the Midwest this year based on 2015 numbers. That shows us as number 6 in terms of what we spend. I mean, $63,000 plus per lane mile. We can't touch New Jersey at 200,000. I mean, who knows what's behind these numbers, I guess is probably one of the questions. But you look at Alaska, which is well below the national average, and with the rest of the Northwest states. So I'm thinking probably there's some ferry cost in our number, but it sure would be interesting to know. And I think if there are those anomalies, we owe it to the public to explain why, and explain why the ferry system is important to the state. For most of us landlubbers, we don't really get it, but we should. We did get over this idea that Spokane County is a donor county when it comes to contributing money to the pot for roads. And I think we should get over this idea that, the ferries ferry counties, that's their problem. I think we all have to understand that there is a network, and the whole network has to function for the pieces, all the pieces, to have value. So the fact that we're so focused on the money issues leads to very high expectations. People, there's a complaint, and they think, wow, roads are expensive, that just ratchets up the intensity. There's a lot of suspicion of waste. No news to you. Also, a lot of resistance to raising more tax to cover the important job that needs to get done. So what are the implications? Obviously cut waste, but that's a lot easier to say than it is to do. I mentioned already, identify what drives our costs, and then we either have to justify them or demonstrate how we're bringing them down. One of my favorite costs that I think we should bring down, I have to put this in just because Joe and everybody else over here has been kind of rabid about, couldn't we get studded tires off the road? Of course, you're familiar that we now charge $5 per tire as a fee, but the damage is $37 to $53 dollars per tire, if I do the math right. These tires are banned in 10 states. Of course, Minnesota and Wisconsin are the two northernmost states where they're banned. I think Michigan has a ban too. They allow studded tires if they don't damage the road, but they haven't found a studded tire that won't damage the road. So I think it's time to think about, how do we bring that charge per tire up? I think a ban is really tough. I don't think people are going to go for that, but they ought to know what kind of damage they're causing, and that it's not really necessary. If they're going to cause it, we probably ought to charge them. In Alaska, they're onto this idea too, and last year there was even a proposal to lift that fee per tire to $75. Be transparent and over-communicate. I think this is a lesson that Spokane took to heart, really starting with Jim West, who was responsible for putting together a $117 million road bond here in Spokane. And technology is our friend. It's amazing the kind of maps and graphics that the city put together to support that campaign, combined with really outstanding public input. They held a series of at least 10 public meetings where, in the neighborhoods even, where they invited people to come and they listened and they made changes to the plan based on what people told them. So the media is your friend here too, because this is a map that we ran recently that had everything from what was completed on the 2004 street bond to TBD projects completed, projects that are planned. Well, we lifted this straight from the city's site, so that's kind of gives you an idea of what people really like to know and what they like to see. This gives them a sense that my neighborhood's being taken care of, which everybody wants to know, and there really is a lot of activity going on. So there's value for the dollars that they're putting into the system. What else? Oh, I think this is really important. I think roads are kind of a proxy for all government because they touch us every single day. So I think it's important, really important, that we work to keep them in good shape, because as go the roads, so go attitudes about all of government. So, no pressure on this group, but it's really an important job that we all are doing. So just to conclude, I think we're feeling relatively good about our roads, but that's probably just because we fixed a lot of potholes. So that kind of gets to what Will's talking about. There's an impression that things are going well, and yet I think if you look you dig into the details of what's under those potholes, you might not have the same impression. We're really wary of the dollars we spend, but generally citizens are kind of lazy about understanding why. That really means we have to spoon feed them. We really do. And I think media, at least in Spokane, are very willing to help, because we know that is a topic that drives hits on the website. Of course, we're either media, speaking as a publisher, we're either your friend or your foe, and we're way better as a friend. Of course, we're always going to point out mistakes, but I think there's real interest in our part to point out what's going right, too. Well, what's my grand finale? I think, as I pointed out, the image of government rests on our shoulders here, and because we're so responsible for not only livelihoods and freight, but kind of the freedom people have to move around. So I just leave it to you that I salute what you're doing. These are tough problems, and there's a lot riding on what we're doing here today. So thank you very much.
I just want to say that my next door neighbor, elderly woman, lovely person, brings over baked goods to me, so I'm very fond of her. Waits every morning at 8:59 for the paper not to be delivered at 8 o'clock so that she can make her almost daily call to the Seattle Times. And I must say, I think she is a little disappointed when the paper's there when she goes out to work. I'm not sure she actually reads the paper, but she does make the call almost every day. Stacy has kind of anticipated the discussion we're going to have at 11:20 when Mike Ribner, the regional administrator for this district, comes to talk about a bridge that came close to failing over the Columbia River. There's not as much traffic as in Genoa, Italy, on the bridge that caused the tragedy that you had so much interest in your papers and papers all over the world. But the fact of the matter is preservation and maintenance does have implications for human lives, and that is something that I'm really looking forward to, because last night at the dinner, Mike would not tell us exactly what he was going to say today. In fact, he refused at least 3 times. I think that it's really interesting that the publisher of a major newspaper has suggested a 5% goal for improving our roads to where there's only 5% rather than 10%. That is a powerful goal, and I hope your newspaper will get behind it. It's your suggestion. Also, the rationalization of charges to cover damage, as well as to rationalize other physical aspects that are measurable, is something that's really important, because there are a lot of, because we're looking for lots and lots of money, we're going to have to look not just in one place, we're going to have to look system-wide to where we can find it. And the fact that we have road users who pay nothing for the use of the roads is something that needs to be looked at. And now that schools are fully funded and constitutionally guaranteed that they're fully funded, the question of why we have this invisible subsidy for schools by virtue of carrying their school buses without paying any gas tax is something we're going to have to ask. And it's not going to make us completely popular with the WA, but I know that they're good people, and they all got big raises this year, so they'll be easy to talk to. It is important that we understand the media is our friend. It is not an enemy of the people. And I know, because your newspaper had the courage to run an editorial on that, and not every newspaper in the state did in August. I'm going to introduce Todd for his panel. I want to Todd's graduate of WSU. He will introduce his speakers. They are 3-0. and they did manage to beat Eastern this year, so I'm sure he will be starting in a good mood. And this year, the Huskies started with a loss, just like Yale, so I'm not going to comment on the quality of the schools, WSU and UW, because it gets me in trouble every time. But Todd, if you'll bring your panel up and introduce them, I really appreciate it. Sure.
Yeah, Bob, can you go ahead and get our slides up by any chance?
Oh, sure.
Bob's our brains behind the technical side. I'll try not to touch the laptop. So as Will mentioned, I'm Todd Treppenhair, Regional Administrator for the South Central Region, which is based out of Yakima. I think you know the state is broke up into 6 regions. You've heard this morning, and a lot of you are pretty much, I think, very much aware of what's going on with the state system. And as Will mentioned, the state's really been trying to get out with this message of this underfunding and preservation and maintenance of the state system in this last year. But, you know, when we think about roads and we dwell on the state system, that's all good and fine. But as important as the state system is, if we don't have the cities and the county systems also understood, we're missing at least half of the boat. And so again, also, as Will kind of mentioned, we do a very good job of writing reports and turning in reports that show that we're actually improving on the situation. We do a good job, just as was mentioned, that the potholes are better right now, so I'm not driving on them. And so the average person can just think, all this is good, when in fact we're just good at making it look good. And it's either bad and you're not seeing it, or it's about to fall apart and you don't understand that. So the idea here was, we had 4 volunteers, very much appreciate them coming up here, from our local folks that work with the cities and counties to talk a little bit about this subject from the perspective of the cities and the counties to see, is this just a state transportation problem, or is this in all of our system? So I'm going to introduce him here. So first, I'll just go down the line. Is Alan Adolph. He's the transportation manager out of Yakima for the Yakima Valley Conference of Governments. Next to him is, I'll never get your name right, Andrea Wickenmüller-Behringer, and she is the executive director for the Walla Walla Valley Metropolitan Planning Organization. Next to her is Brian Malley, and he is the executive director for the Benton Franklin Council of Governments. And then taking the end of the table there is Sabrina Menschel from this area. So she's the executive director for the Spokane Regional Transportation Council. And we have a couple slides that they may reference as they go through. First, I'm just going to maybe let them each say a little bit more about the area that they represent and maybe just some opening remarks. And then we have some questions that I'm going to moderate asking them so that we can have a kind of a format to talk about this over the next 40 minutes. So with that, Alan, do you mind?
Again, my name is Alan Adolph. I'm the Transportation Program Manager for Yakima Valley Conference of Governments. We are a county MPO, RTPO within the boundaries of Yakima County. Yakima County has just a little over 250,000 people, 14 jurisdictions, 1 county, and the DOT are all members of our MPO, RTPO. I'll go in a little bit more, since Todd already brought it, a little bit more into the county. Yakima County only has a tax base. It's the 2nd largest county in the state, but can only receive taxes on about 28% of its land mass due to the Yakima Training Center, various state and federal lands, and the Yakima Indian Nation. That leaves a smaller property tax base to seek funds. As of this morning, I confirmed the Yakima County, they have about 1,550 miles of roads throughout Yakima County. About 1/3 of those are still gravel. And I believe it's the only county in eastern Washington where all roads are considered all-weather roads all year long. That is a county policy, so they not only have to maintain the paved roads within the county, but they also have to maintain the gravel roads within the county. We do have some demographic issues in comparison to the state. We have a poverty rate twice that of the state of Washington. Yakima County has approximately a 20% poverty rate compared to about 11%, I think, statewide. And our median property value is about 55% of the state average. About 160,000 compared to a little over 300,000 statewide. Also, wages on all jobs, mostly due to agriculture and other service, is about a third that of the state average. So for Yakima County, we do have significant financial issues in our ability to generate revenue locally for both maintenance and preservation, let alone trying to raise money for new projects to grow our communities, not only for roads, but for alternative transportation as well.
Thank you. Andrea.
Andrea Beckmüller-Behringer. Andrea works right. I represent the Walla Walla Valley Metropolitan Planning Organization. We are a sub-regional transportation planning organization. We're almost county-wide. We're actually a bi-state organization. Our federal role extends into Oregon. Part of our membership includes Umatilla County and Milton Freewater in Oregon. We consist of about 1,300 square miles, so rather large, have only 65,000 people. 8,000 of those live south of the border in Oregon. We don't necessarily have the same kind of financial issues as Yakima County, but we have a quarter of our roads are still gravel. We don't have all weather roads. We have quite a few that are only passable during the spring and summer and a little bit of the fall, and then the rest of the time they're not maintained because they're mostly for harvest. Our economy is rather diverse. A lot of it is still based on agriculture, but the wine industry and tourism plays an ever-increasing role. With that, we have a lot of other pressures within the county itself. Housing affordability has become a burning front topic that really everybody in the county needs to deal with. And when I say member entities, I'm talking of small rural entities that only have 325 people to our largest city that is 33,000. So there's a lot of different needs and a lot of different financial backgrounds. What I can tell you is that in terms of local roadways, in some cases there's a 200-year replacement plan for local roads, and in other cases there's no replacement plan because there's simply not enough funding to actually make a plan. It's not worth it. So it's a lot of worst first rather than a planned approach to roadway rehabilitation, which is rather striking. Don't scare.
Brian.
Thank you for being here, everybody. My name is Brian Malley, Benton Franklin Council of Governments. You've heard of the Tri-Cities. A lot of people think of that as being 3 cities. There's actually not 4, but 5 in our metropolitan planning area, including West Richmond and Benton City. Our region is about 290,000 people between Benton and Franklin counties, and a small portion of Walla Walla County, Burbank. We're a lot like Spokane in that we're a hub for your highways and your rail. On top of that, we've got the marine system of the Columbia Snake system. It's a very fast-growing area. It kind of mirrors the rates of growth in Seattle. Numerically, we've been growing even greater at a rate than Spokane and Vancouver in lots of time. So we're faced with a rapidly growing area, preservation needs that are rather daunting, to be frank, in both the urban and rural areas. And coupled with that, a need for, frankly, capacity expansion. So trying to find project funding and balancing that with the maintenance and preservation needs is a daunting task. Both urban and rural areas. We're the 4th largest metro area in the state, and happy to be here to talk about the challenges on the transportation system.
Thanks, Brian. Sabrina.
Sabrina Minshaw, Executive Director for Spokane Regional Transportation Council. I've been in this role just over a year. Prior to that, I came from the MPO in Ada County, which is the Boise area. And prior to that, I actually worked at a countywide highway district for about 8 years. A couple of those years, I managed the pavement management program in that county. And if you've been in the Boise area, what's really unique about that area is it actually is a countywide highway district. So all the roads that are not state highways are managed by a countywide highway district, so you don't have the different jurisdictions. And part of the reason why that happened at the time is because there's such a discrepancy between the city and the county roadways. And the county roadways were in such better condition than the city roadways. The back in the 70s that the county voted to incorporate them all and set up a separate district. Part of what happened with that is then there was actually a really large push to have pavement management become a really high priority. And a lot of focus on understanding the difference between pavement preservation and then what happens when your roadways get to the poor condition where you're actually in a reconstruction type situation. So most of you are very familiar with Spokane County, but a couple things that I just wanted to bring up as introductory comments and talk a little bit more about is, while we talk in general about the need for maintenance, there is a big difference between the state system and the county and the local systems. In the sense that, one, when we talk about large statistics, the statistics that really happen in each of our jurisdictions can get lost in those big numbers. So for example, new targets are coming out that we talk about the state system being a target of 10% only in poor condition. At least in Spokane County, and I've ventured to say in most of these other counties, our poor condition is much higher than 10%. So if we're setting a target as low as 10%, that's probably could happen a long time before we get to 10%. And a lot of those are not on our state system, they're on our local and county systems. And part of the why we have to ask ourselves is because our cities and our counties, for those of you that are elected officials work with them, is they have a lot of other pressing needs that are right in front of them. The majority of our city and county budgets are going to our emergency services. And those are things that we all have right in front of us every day that we're trying to say, how do we fund police officers and firefighters and your sewer and water systems? Those are the things that are competing, every day, every year for the budget against roads. And it's important we all say, and I agree with Stacy, that the roads are the most important thing. And if a firefighter or a policeman doesn't show up at your house, or you have property crime issues, those are just as important, and you struggle with that. And that's part of what Ada County struggled with in the 70s, is by creating an independent district. That road dollars, and that's why if you go to Boise, you think, man, these roads are incredible, but they don't compete. Those dollars don't compete against those other interests. Now, there's a lot of other challenges with having road districts completely separate from cities and counties. But that's just one issue with the funding. Another, just a couple of interesting, this diagram is just an example, this is not ours, but this is kind of a pavement preservation shark fin diagram for those of you who are in the industry. And really the main point here to look at is it's kind of the right preservation treatment at the right time. So if we're able to realize that when our roads are in still that good condition or the fair condition, and we're doing some sort of preventative maintenance here, either the chip seals or maybe the grind and overlays, we can do some sort of treatment here that's, $7 or $9 a square foot. If we wait till they're in that poor condition, we're down here at 7 or 8 times the cost it was costing us back at the fair condition, or the good, when it was still in good condition. So the problem is when we're in a 10% down here at the state, or in our case, at the 35 or 40% poor condition, we're spending so much more money here because we weren't able to spend the money up here. And the challenge that most of our cities and counties are at is we've got to balance both, because we already have so many roads that are in that bad condition. How much money do we invest to try to fix those at that really high rate versus at the same time we're trying to invest the money in the roads that are still in good condition? And then how do we explain to the public, working with our media, why are we putting treatments on roads that seem like they're just fine when they have a road that's falling apart? And that's a hard message. The other example, and again, this is just an example that many jurisdictions have done, and this is something that we'll be working on in Spokane County and many of the other MPOs, is this an example of the unfunded backlog and what happens? So let's say, for example, and this is a very high level example, but if we're setting a target that we want to maintain our road condition at this 6970, which is a relatively really high PCI, this is where the Ada County said theirs at. If we want to set it here, and we're going across time from where we are here, that we want to keep it here, yet we fund at the same level we're funding at now. This is our backlog of how much maintenance needs to happen. If we fund at the same time, our unfunded backlog continues to grow. So even though, this is kind of the law of the averages, even though we may have some of our good roads are getting better, those bad roads are continuing to grow. So regardless, this unfunded backlog is continuing to grow. We will never really meet that pavement condition. So it's an ongoing challenge, especially with the local and state government. So that's really the message I think we want to have you walk away with, that it's a different condition and that we all have to work together, but funding is even more challenging for the state and the locals.
Okay, thank you very much for those opening remarks. So we're going to go ahead and move into our formal questions here to get some more conversation going. We're going to jump back and ask Alan to speak on this one first. Our first question for the panel is, with what you know, what do you know about the local agencies actually look to for their needed maintenance and preservation funding. And what do you know about their thoughts on what they're thinking about that availability? And try and do that both in terms of short-term and long-term. So where are funds available for them? Where do they choose to look for them? And how does that play in short-term and long-term?
I think it's in most cases, most local jurisdictions, you have property tax and gas tax is pretty much the meat and potatoes for most jurisdictions. As I mentioned with Yakima County, just the property values compared to maybe a richer county, the impact that we get from property tax revenue is significantly less. It hampers our jurisdiction's ability to gain funds and build on that. Since the Transportation Benefit District process was approved here several years ago, I think about a third of the municipalities have enacted transportation benefit districts, in part to address special projects that otherwise just there isn't a funding source out there for. In some cases, for matching funds for existing projects through such as TIB or other programs, and to some extent as well try to address some maintenance and preservation issues. One thing that we do have in Yakima County, we do not have good roads. In terms of the organization, we do have good roads in the system. About 2001, took a lesson from the Walla Walla group, Good Roads group, and formed a group called Transaction. This is elected officials, business leaders, public works personnel, planners, who needed to address transportation issues in the metropolitan Yakima area. 5 years later, Driving Rural Yakima Valley's Economy, or DRIVE, was formed in the lower Yakima Valley. Similar needs, but different approaches, different aspects. Lower Valley, you have jurisdictions far apart, transactions, you have municipalities right on each other's doorsteps. Basically, it started looking at road projects, the Nob Hill SR 82 project was the first successful project that we got with the nickel program, I think it was. And so we do have a variety of projects on there. One of the things that's always been on the back table though has always still been maintenance and preservation. There just has not been an investment on a state and federal level to address those concerns, and that is becoming more and more of an issue that our committees are wanting to approach both on the state and federal level as our members go and speak to those groups. It's got to the point, I don't think our local jurisdictions can do the work themselves anymore. The cost is the same, if not higher, to preserve a rural community as it is a metropolitan area. The further away you get from the resource, the more it still costs in terms of ability, and they're having revenue growth slower than your municipalities. So assistance to smaller jurisdictions is definitely an issue, and they're starting to look at that in a more political arena in terms of law.
So good, also one of the things I kind of picked up on there is Harry was able to get a couple large projects, but again, sitting in the background is this need of preservation and maintenance for the local system, and it's just not there. So let's move on to Andrea. So in the Walla Walla area, again, how then would you match up or add on to what Alan is saying on how the jurisdictions that you interact with, what they're thinking about is actually there for available funding? How does that match up with their need? And do they think of it in terms of like tomorrow or in terms of 10 years from now?
Of course, the local sources are the same as Alan described. However, the entities that I work with are predominantly relying on state and federal grants, just simply because the local money stretches a lot farther when it's used as a match rather than the ultimate source. So it's very often that we have 5 or 6 different funding sources on one project. Trying to pull all of those grants together takes a lot of time, there's a lot of stress, it takes expertise, and I'm really glad to see so many good grants come into the region, but, you know, historical growth on those grants has been very minimal. The cost is skyrocketing. And when we worked on our long-range transportation plan, we took all of the historical grants that came into the area based on the good grant writing, and then projected that out to the future and projected out costs just for basic maintenance. We fell short by about 50%. So the maintenance cycles are getting longer. The maintenance in some cases is completely deferred. And ultimately, what Serena showed earlier, this backlog of deferred maintenance is going to add up to total reconstruction cost, which is so much higher. So the outlook, the future outlook, we don't have enough as of today. We're falling short by 50%. That falling short is only going to grow. And it is a tremendous strain because it's hard to understand for citizens that the local roads are not touched at all because they're not even eligible for the state and federal grants that are out there. So it's only the major thoroughfares that are being touched and maintained, whereas the local roads, everybody knows exactly which road not to go on, and it's just the unfortunate visitor who stumbles into one of those streets, and lo and behold, they have to go 5 miles an hour because otherwise it's going to take out one of their tires. Of course, it's not that extreme on all roadways, but that's the current reality, and there is, at this point in time, really no possible future with the current funding situation that will make this go away. So, when I was speaking of 200-year replacement cycle, that was very optimistic, and when I was talking with one of our entities, they just simply said, there's no sense in planning for any kind of replacement because we know we don't have the funding. That's the reality. Not to say that the Transportation Benefit District has not been a major boon, but when you can think of only having 2 10-year terms to draw on some of this money and then you have to sunset this because it's required, this is a temporary fix and that's all it is. So one of our entities, they don't know what to do after 2022 when their 2 10-year terms run out. And then it's going to get really worse because people just got used to having a little bit of money to have some of those roads fixed, and that is going away. And the explanations that will have to follow, I kind of wish I could retire before that.
So Brian, you said in your opening comments, you talked a little bit about how your area is having this economic growth. So in your area, hey, economic growth, right? So this problem must not exist then. You must be hearing from the locals that they have all the funding that they need. So basically go back to the same question on from there, and basically, and yet counties that are growing very much because of some economic things that are taking place in the Tri-Cities. What are you hearing from your jurisdictions on their ability to deal with the maintenance and preservation of their roadways?
Sure, well, that's not the case.
Of course, I knew that.
I described our area as having a number of jurisdictions, even in the Tri-City area. We have a couple different counties, and they are a little bit different, each of them, Benton and Franklin. I reached out to our members and asked these questions to get their take and received different responses. Some cities have gone to the Transportation Benefit District, like Spokane has done. I believe in our area, City of Prosser and Richland have definitely done so. I don't believe others. I know some others are considering it. But Richland is an example of a city who has implemented a $20 license tab. But even with that, their Public Works Department needs to really search out and determine a lot of other sources for their preservation, just basic preservation of their system. General fund, the fuel tax proceeds, you name it, reaching out to programs like TIB, CRAB, occasionally pursuing the SDP funds from the region, though some of those mentioned aren't really, don't have a lot of revenue aimed at preservation needs. They like to build projects and new type things. In the city of Richland's case, they estimate about a $5 million annual need for their preservation of just their core system, and with that benefit district, still see themselves short of approximately 20 to 30%. So that's a daunting challenge as you look to do it in the short term or long term. City of Pasco, on the other hand, their figures are much more lower than the city of Richland. They estimate about $752 million a year for preservation needs, and city backlog very similar to what Sabrina described on the graphic above. The inability to keep up and growing backlog. So I think in the long and short term, what we see, the reference to the local system is a real big factor. Andrea made reference to it. Most of these sources, focuses upon the functionally classified system, your major arterials and your collectors. When you get down to the local roadways, it really becomes a challenge, especially in a growing area where you've got a lot of local access roads, and the preservation needs are there on that system just as much as the federal system.
Thanks, Brian. So Sabrina, in the Spokane area, similar themes or a different feel here in this part of the state?
Well, I think that there is a feeling atmosphere that we are starting to grow, especially in certain parts of the county, and then that's a really good thing in terms of economy. But we still have then the pressures of both pavement maintenance and then trying to meet the growing expansion needs. And how those things get balanced is part of the challenge. So finding those innovative ways, I think a couple things to notice, the revenues that are available then to the state, to the cities and counties, again, some of those are dependent upon the economy. And knowing some of those cycles that come up and down, because we don't have the state income tax, we don't have some of the same vehicle registration fees that are dedicated just to this, those limits. So a couple of things that I've been impressed that our board of directors, under the leadership of Commissioner French, Joe Torelli, and Mike Gribner, have started looking at how can we leverage our STBG money to look and see partnering with TIB or the County Road Board, knowing that we don't, not only the pavement and maintenance projects, but in some of our expansion and new projects, we don't have enough money to fund individual projects. So how can we leverage and be more competitive against some of our neighbors to be able to leverage some of those projects so it frees up other money for the road pavement projects. So I think that we're having to look at all those sorts of strategies to figure it out, keeping in mind sometimes the road projects are the ones to go when there's other funds within the budget, and that's just that's a challenge. The other thing, it goes back, and I think some of the things that Stacy hit on is really important, is messaging. We have to continue to elevate this issue, that it, just because it looks fresh and has a fresh coat of pavement on it, doesn't mean it's not going to be an issue the next year. We're going to talk a little bit about, of course, what the winters do in these kind of areas, especially on this east side of the state, but we have to continue to message it. It has to become an elevated issue, and we have to look at how are we spending our money in other places in transportation. Are there ways to make some of these large capital projects more effective and more efficient so that our system is more efficient? We're spending less money on those types of transportation projects and freeing up more money for our maintenance and preservation. And those are just tough choices. They're really tough choices. I have a slide up here at the end that we don't really do ribbon cuttings a lot of time on maintenance projects. They're not super exciting, but we have to change our messaging under what's important and how do we spend those dollars. And some people, like I said, we have some really strong folks that have been in the transportation and government agency a long time on our board, understand that, but it still is a balance, because to bring in businesses, they care what the condition of your roads are. And so, that matters. And so we have to make sure we know the link between economic development and our roads, and that's part of our message.
So next question, I'm going to go ahead and start down again with you, Sabrina, since you have that 10 years experience specifically managing pavement. So we know that the federal government does try and assist with a lot of these things, and they want to make sure that funds that are coming, that people have plans and are using them correctly. So they've been requiring the state to actually produce measurements on how we're working with pavement, and we have to send that to them to continue to get state funds. So again, every good action that someone takes always seems to have other ripples that they haven't considered. So thinking again about the jurisdictions that you're aware of, what are the challenges that are created for these local agencies by having these federal pavement ratings and target requirements that are all kind of taking place?
Sure. Well, our board of directors at Spokane just had a really robust conversation with our board of directors last month about this. I think we're really lucky, again, coming from another state, that WSGRTA has a pretty good handle on the condition, at least of the state roads, and on some of those functionally classified roads, where they're not taking just what's required by the feds, they're looking at what the conditions are. Now, taking that back to our individual agencies, especially some of these smaller agencies, they don't necessarily have that same information. However, for those of you who are just starting to hear some about this, the federal government is coming down with saying you have to set targets, and they're giving us how those have to be set. And one of them is some conditions, they call it IRI and PCI. We always speak in acronyms in the government. But essentially, they're just kind of the difference of what we call leading and trailing indicators. So kind of a leading indicator is when you start to have health issues, you're like, I'm just kind of feeling sluggish, or, I'm not waking up as early, or my knees or back starting to hurt. So you're thinking, well, I need to figure out what's going on. I should eat healthier, right? So I should eat healthier, I need to drink more water, I should start running. And so you start looking at things like, what am I eating? And your doctor's telling you, your cholesterol is a little high, your blood pressure. So you're knowing ahead of time that something's coming. So that comes back to our graph, right? We're looking at something, we know something's coming, we're starting to look at it. That's what we're hearing from the state DOT, that's what you're hearing from us at MPOs. Unfortunately, what's happening, and I don't know that they've figured out a better way, but sometimes what was coming from the federal government is this trailing indicator. Like, we've all weighed ourselves and we're like, how all of a sudden did we become 40 pounds overweight? What just happened? And that's because now we're saying, our roads, everything's in really bad condition. How do we fix it now? Versus when you saw those original test results, you're like, things are starting to look bad. And your doctor's telling you along the way, well, that's when he's saying, you really need to start eating better. You need to start exercising. So we have all these warning signs. The question is, as regional governments and all of our members, are we here or are we gonna deal with it here? So we're trying to say, what are these things that we can do now? What are the things that we can start messaging and start making adjustments to? And so that's really, I think, our message, at least, about pavement ratings and target requirements is we do have to meet what the federal government is telling us. And that's an added burden, not only for the state, but for all the MPOs. But we don't want to forget those leading indicators and do things that really are meaningful to things that are all viewed, things that make sense, things that aren't all in acronyms, things that we can measure, things like, how does our pavement get from being bad to where we can measure it? And what is that target? Is it 5%, as Stacy said? Does that mean anything to everybody? Maybe it's citizens' input. We've got to have some way to measure it so we can talk about it that's meaningful to our communities.
So Brian, kind of the same question. So from the jurisdictions that you interact with, as these more and more requirements are coming in and telling them what they got to do to be able to play in this grant game to get some of this federal money, what kind of challenges do you see they're having with that?
Well, I think that, first of all, just getting clarity on the performance measures, how they'll be implemented and what they are, to meet the criteria once they are established. I think really there's a lack of clarity yet in some of these areas. And I think that our jurisdictions kind of struggle with that bit. We're working pretty hard with them on these performance measure topics, and as they gain clarity on, we'll obviously be looking to meet federal standards. But one of the challenges that our members pass along to us is that these federal performance measures are applicable, they think, to the federal system, and an emphasis may be needed on those functionally classified roadways, again, at the expense of maintenance needs maybe on the local system. I know the NHS funds, for example, National Highway System funds that come into our region, there are some local roadways designated as NHS routes. They're fairly minimal amount of funds. Certainly not sufficient to keep those roadways up to the local standards anticipated by these performance measures. So that's really the challenge. It's not a unique story to our region. We're probably much different than that with the others, but that's what we're hearing from our members.
So Andre, same question you said in your last remarks about how they have to go to 5, 6 fund sources to try and put together a project, and of course some of them are the feds and the feds are requiring these. So again, what does that look like for them? How much strain does that put on these small jurisdictions to have to think about all those funding sources and meeting these federal requirements?
The pavement grading is really only one of the things that are being looked at when roadways are selected for projects. Pavement grading, that's just the surface. What is underneath that? Do the utilities need to be replaced? So a lot of times you might have a really bad road with a really bad pavement grading, but you're waiting because you know your utilities are good for another 5 years, and there's no way you want to rip up that road regardless of what that pavement grading is at this point in time. So pavement grading has always been one of the project selection criteria for the federal money that comes through our office. That was something that all of the member entities, that was an immediate consensus. There was no discussion because they all realized that pavement grading is important. But again, it's only one of the many because you really want to look at the entire roadway system as a whole, and pavement grading is just one of those. So it's a good tool, but if there's too much emphasis on just the pavement grading, because it is now a federal requirement to set targets, then you're kind of losing out on having the flexibility to decide what road needs to be done first because of various reasons. In addition to that, at this point in time, and I'm going to say this tongue-in-cheek, the MPOs are not going to get slapped on their hands when we fail our pavement grading. At this point in time, we're not even anywhere close to, I wish we were close to the 10% for very poor and poor. We're well above 10%, and we're going to stay there because of the funding situation as it is right now and as we project it to be in the future. However, the state is going to get dinged if, on average, the state pavements, and that includes the local portion of the national highway system, is not 10% or better for poor and very poor pavement. At that point in time, the money is redirected, the state's money is being redirected to those areas that need pavement improvements, and we have no idea yet of how this is going to play out across the regions. So it is a fear factor, not so much pressure on the MPO itself at this time, but fear of how this will develop in the future and how will this develop a funding situation that affects each region differently. And that I'm a little worried about, and so are my member entities, because that is something we have absolutely no control over. We are still going to use pavement grading as a guide for project selection, but again, it is just one of many criteria in the decision making. And as that, we assign a certain importance to it, but it's not the be-all, end-all.
Al, what are other ideas? And
Well, I think for some of the really small jurisdictions, you already have a pavement grading target setting apparatus, and that's just the local population. In your smaller jurisdictions, your next door neighbor is going to tell you that the road is out, or your primary business person. In your Yakimas, your Spokanes, your Kennewick's and Seattle's, you probably will never meet the guy who's repairing your road. There's already that impetus to have those roads be in as good a condition as they can. With regards to, I think, a lot of the federal pavement ratings and requirements that may come down the pike, there's still uncertainty, at least on the smaller jurisdiction level. In part, what will they require? Not necessarily this time, but at the next transportation bill. Will they ratchet those requirements up even higher? How do you then perform those duties? Are they within your limited staff's ability to do those ratings? Do you have to contract that out, whether a larger government or a contractor? You do that, all of a sudden your already extremely limited operations budget now has gotten that much more tight that it doesn't give you the dollars in your general fund maybe to address even the low-cost payment improvements that can be done to prolong your system.
we're going to jump back down to the end, so since let Sabrina have a chance to talk again with our third question. So you kind of seen on the spike there was a really bad winter that when Stacy put that up there, and then there was a little spike in 2017, and I know in my region that was a real bad year. So what type of challenges, when there are these extreme weather winters that come up, that just kind of lay havoc to the roads? What does that then do to the local folks, and how do they deal with that?
So I'll speak at it from a programming money perspective. I know some of my colleagues can talk a little bit more from the localized area. I think one of the challenges that we've heard from our folks is it makes it really hard to know what roads you're going to repair and how that can get you a chance to program projects. So for example, if you've applied for a grant or you have in your cycle, sometimes agencies are able, at least the larger ones, to program 3 or 4 years out. Well, if you've had a bad year, and some of these examples in this area and Boise as well, where you've had, at least on the eastern side of the state, where you have really bad freeze-thaw cycles, one bad winter and what you thought was your pavement condition index can drop 30, 35 points. And so your plan to use maybe federal money or a couple grants, what you thought you could wait 4 years on, all of a sudden is an emergency. And so it needs to happen that year, or it has to happen at least before the next winter. And so all of a sudden your plans and all that money you had secured has to move. And not all funding grant cycles are that nimble. And so one of the things, again, with our board, and we've heard our local agencies, is we at least have said, well, we're going to put a set aside on money on years 3 and 4 and be able to do a pavement call closer to when they're actually going to program money. It still doesn't solve the 1 year problem, but at least it's closer for the time that people and agencies might actually know what those conditions are going to be. Because pavement in that condition, I think somebody said, it's like a chance in time. And so every year, unless you're out there assessing pavement every year, your pavement condition can change. And that's one of the challenges with, Alan mentioned, it's really labor intensive to know the condition of your system, from a measurement perspective. And so you may think, and you're budgeting money, and this is what we hear from our, you're budgeting money saying this project's going to cost $1 million. Well, you may have assessed it 3 years ago. By the time you get back out there, it's no longer $1 million, it's $1.6 million. And it's not because agencies have done anything wrong, it's the condition changed in 3 years. What you thought, you had water seep in, you had a freeze-thaw cycle, all of a sudden the cracks didn't get sealed, you got a lot of damage to your subbase, and what you thought might have been just a basic mill and overlay, all of a sudden is a full reconstruction. And so we just have to realize that with our climate, and that is not a national issue because not all climates have that problem. Not even everywhere in the state has that problem. So when we have this conversation about what happens and how bad winters are, we have to make sure that we're explaining why that's the case and why our costs can change so quickly and escalate. We have to make sure our funding partners, which I know the ones in this room do, our funder partners understand that, and that we have an ability to be able to be flexible and change projects in and out, and that I think WSGRTA understands that as well, that we've got to be able to make those kind of movements and shifts and be able to work with each other to do that. So
Brian, have you seen your jurisdictions react to this and deal with these issues?
Well, the Tri-Cities, we're not accustomed to having the kind of winters we did in 16, 17. We get a snowfall here and there, and we get frequent icings, 3 or 4 times a year. Not in 16, 17. The snow fell on December 22nd and was still around Valentine's Day. So we're not accustomed to that. We had a winter harsher than you folks here in Spokane, which we don't get to say that very well, next to ever. Our staff and jurisdictions down there are not accustomed to those kind of winters. The toil that it takes on their system, it was pretty dramatic, potholes, probably all over this place. So obviously their budgets weren't prepared for that type of winter, and they need to be nimble and adjust just like most areas would when you get that kind of impact. The metropolitan area, on top of the preservation, just having the equipment to clear the roadways is another real big challenge. Pretty limited fleet. I know in my case, I was stuck in my home 3 or 4 days, couldn't get out. So that's, you've probably all been in similar circumstances. Another thing that happened in our region that was a real challenge is when the melt came. Out in the rural areas, we had some washouts and runoff issues, disaster declarations, that type of thing. It kind of speaks to that all-weather road system that Alan made mention of. In our region, we've gone to an effort of identifying kind of a core all-weather road system, one that can handle the movement of goods and commerce on any given day, regardless of freeze-thaw cycles. We need to continue that type of work and try and pursue kind of a dedicated source of funding for that, those type of roads. I think just really just a unique winter for us and not something we're accustomed to dealing with. And I think this speaks to the fact of limited resources, being nimble and able to adjust your priorities. Because when you've got washouts and roads that are no longer functional, you obviously need to get them back up and operable.
Todd, would it be okay if I chimed in on this? You're okay with it?
No, yeah.
So I'm actually pro our Transportation Improvement Board. When the big winter hit 2 winters ago, we got dozens of phone calls immediately. Can you provide assistance? We were a little lucky that we happened to have 2 big projects that came in under budget, and suddenly we had a $5 million fund balance we weren't anticipating. And our board chose to do a one-time emergency repair program for small cities and then cities with a low assessed value. And our conditions were, if it was really bad, that means you needed to do the work that summer. You couldn't overwinter it or do it in the future. We limited it to $50,000 grants, and we put specific criteria. If the road was completely shot, it was just shot. But the long story short, 92 jurisdictions participated in it.
92 needed this
92.
assistance.
92 needed assistance. The average, even though the cap was 50,000, some only needed a few $1,000s of work, some needed all 50,000. So the average is about 30,000. So we pushed about $3 million out the door in one summer. Again, we had the benefit of 2 turnbacks, otherwise we wouldn't have had the capacity. But the other thing we were able to do is, because it was so severe, Grant County and I think one other met FEMA requirements for emergency, and we were able to help provide the match for the FEMA repairs. But one of the things that came out of that, and that's why I raised my hand, is FEMA provides 75%. There's a state program out of the operating budget that of the remaining 25% match, the state provides 12.5%, and then cities have come to us for that balance of 12.5% because they don't have 2 pennies to rub together. And I would hope that maybe one of our messages back to the legislature is when there's an emergency, it's great that the state has that bucket, but it doesn't recognize ability to pay. And so I'd like to see some sort of sliding scale for those smaller communities to have a little recognition that they just don't have the funds to provide. And we at TIB, we're lucky, and I can't always bank on that as a year to year, our ability to help those jurisdictions. But I did want to kind of put that out there, that it was absolutely crushing for a lot of those communities, and we just were lucky at the right time to help as many as we could.
Yes, Andre, I guess maybe you can add to that, as Ashley mentioned, we just had that winter to talk about, so it's a good example, and Will always is using quotes. I think we just got another, they don't have 2 pennies to rub together.
Yeah.
So with these jurisdictions that just don't have anything left, and they have to do this planning that we're talking about, and all of a sudden they get this crazy, bad washouts, whatever, thrown in there, what happens?
They were lucky enough to get one of those TID emergency grants, because otherwise they would not have been able to fix that roadway. Now, the bigger entities within my planning area, they simply took money off projects that they had already planned for future years and used it to repair the road. So future projects were just simply, they were put on ice in order to fix the ice damage. And there was just that much. Usually there's a certain amount that is budgeted every year based on historical, frost heave damage. That winter was just so bad. They ran through that fund, next to nothing, and then they had to dip into their future project funds in order to fix the roadways to a point where they were usable. They were not even usable. The frost heave had been that bad. It was phenomenal to see some of the roadways. Because it is uncontrollable and really nobody can tell you what kind of damage you're looking at winter after winter, the fact that they're planning for this kind of damage on average is great, but then to be hit with such a winter where it goes beyond anything that you have seen before, it ruins all of your project and rehabilitation and road building projects for years to come, because that is something that completely does away with all 6 years of the comprehensive transportation planning project list, and you start fresh, because at that point in time you have no money to build anything for a year, 2, possibly 3 or 4.
Pushing up against time limits, so anything to add, Alan?
Yeah, I think that particular year, most of our jurisdictions had already blown through most of their snow removal funds for that year, so they didn't even have pre-programmed dollars that maybe they could have used for that. And it wasn't a case of, we know this road is just kind of going, and it was just the last straw that road failed. Some of these roads, they failed in a matter of a week. That there was no way to prepare for it. There was no way, because of the weather conditions, to go in there and protect it. It was, one day it was good, next day it was bad, and there were phone calls. Ashley, thank you for bringing that up. I was going to mention it. Kudos to your effort. I think that's something that local jurisdictions will be approaching Ashley and his staff and any other programs, is figure out a way to make out-of-the-norm type event like this, something we can have an insurance plan behind where funds could be available, and if not needed that year, the weather's better, it goes back to the general fund, being a little bit more adaptable to how local jurisdictions.
So we're up against time. I do want to give each panel member one moment to, if there was one idea you wanted to leave this audience with as your closing remark, what would that be? We're going to start down at the end of Sabrina.
So, Will mentioned that Mike Grimner wouldn't tell anybody what his speech was about, so I'm gonna hope I don't take his hunch here, because we're usually on the same page with this one. My point really, I think, is it's about funding. We have two options. You can grow the pot, or you can figure out how you're spending the pot. And ideally, continuing to build new roads and new intersections, because we all have growth, is a very expensive proposition. And for cities and counties who also have other things that are pulling at their budgets, it becomes an even more challenge to make those choices, and they are tough choices. But one of the things that we can continue to do is really look at how do we make our system more effective and make those choices and look at practical solutions to reduce those costs. And not always for the long term, but at least how do we phase some of those costs while we're trying to have our economy grow. And as we do that, and as we look at other things between transit or active transportation, other ways to reduce the demand on our system, we can free up more money to be able to do things in maintenance, and then we're also doing our message. So when I was speaking earlier, I talked about we don't do ribbon cuttings very often on maintenance projects. Well, as we raise that message and bar to our public that helps know how important that maintenance is, it helps our local elected officials release some of that pressure when they're getting the pressure to do a lot of the new roads. And when their system can move more effectively, there's less demand and pressure to be able to say, I need this intersection or I need an additional lane, because those things are way expensive. So those are all choices we each have to make, not only in our region, but in our state. But understanding that and communicating that will make this conversation a lot easier.
Brian, let's take this opportunity. What's one point you would like to leave this audience with understanding?
Well, I think that, amongst our membership, there's a desire for, obviously, a source of preservation funding, maintenance type funding, but something that might be unique from that of new project capacity type funding projects. A user fee or some sort of system to get to the use of the system that could be widely accepted. But really, I think it just goes back to the basic message. There's a need out there. The preservation needs are great, and the sources of revenue right now are just limited. I think that we've got a daunting challenge in front of us in the immediate and long terms, and working on some sort of system to identify a revenue source that's dedicated to preservation would be key.
Okay.
I spoke earlier of some of the projects having 5 or 6 different funding sources. There seems to be a growing prejudice against federal grants, understandably, because of the federal requirements that come along the federal strings. It makes the entire project, at a minimum, 20 to 25% more expensive, in some cases much more than that. However, knowing that there is only limited funding from any of those sources, not being able to cobble these monies together, because there might be a time impact or a regulatory impact, that is a growing concern among my members, because there's not a single funding source for them that would cover the entire roadway project. In addition to that, some of the smaller communities, they're dealing with small projects, and having federal funds on a small project is an absolute nightmare, because you're spending so much in administrative costs just to be able to get the funds and administer the project, that at this point in time, it's not worth it. As a matter of fact, one of my entities shared with me that they were considering turning down a $3 million safety grant, because it was federal money, because of all of the strings that were attached to it. I'm dumbfounded, $3 million that they would even consider turning this down. So the prejudice against federal funds is real. However, the strings attached to federal funds for project administration, construction administration, it's a growing concern, because the regulatory pressure gets higher and higher.
Alice?
20 years ago, my agency's executive director, Von Wyrick, met with Karen Schmidt. I believe she was transportation chair at the time, seeking some help for the town of Harrah. It's a small town, about 600 people in the middle of the Yakima Indian Reservation, needing to improve a rail crossing in the middle of town. And she asked, why would we spend $250,000 to do that? And he asked her, where do you do your grocery shopping at? QFC. Do you buy apples? Yeah. Do you know where they come from? Well, probably one from Yakima Valley. So, Karen, do you like mushy apples? Do you like nice crisp apples? What do you get when you go to the store? I said, well, obviously I don't want a nice crisp apple. You know, you don't want bruising, you don't get your money's worth. He says, well, chances are that apple you ate went through the town of Harris. And it's crossing this railroad track that has potholes, and the rail, the separation was all bumpy, and that truck is going to have damaged fruit that's going to go to market, and you're either going to have a good piece of fruit or you're going to have a bad piece of fruit. So for $250,000, you can fix this road, that truck's going to pass a nice smooth crossing, and you're going to have good fruit. And the reason I tell you that story is, for most of us, we've got a lot of small communities in rural Washington that feeds the Spokanes, the Tacomas, the Portlands. We need to be able to get those products to market. We need to get them on a road system that is not going to ruin the fruit, ruin the product. It lowers their value, their ability to have income, their ability to build tax base. It reduces your local businesses and your big city's ability to sell all of your product not at a loss, which again builds tax base and allows us to continue to build roads. Money spent in rural areas can be generational. $5 million spent in the town of Wapato or College Place, that project might last for 20 years. $5 million spent, Seattle's probably going to be torn out and rebuilt 5 years from now for something else. So an investment in rural communities, be it preservation, be it maintenance, not only saves you and the larger cities money, it improves the quality of life of those local communities and their ability to continue to provide to the society and the region as a whole.
Well, panel, thank you for bringing your expertise and sharing it here today. Everyone, will you thank them?
Just one more minute. Since one of the smartest guys in the room got a question, I think it's important that the dumbest student in the room get a question, and so when I ask it. On your graph, you indicated that the number of the number of projects are going up. Is it also the case that the severity of the problems that you're facing with those projects is going up at the same time? So that there's kind of a multiplicative aspect to this, whoever wants to answer.
On this chart?
No, the one before.
Right.
So is it not only the fact that we have more projects that are getting in the backlog, but that the projects in the backlog are getting worse?
Correct, because they aren't being addressed while you're up here earlier, they're getting to this case. So the more that we don't address here, the more expensive they are, as well as more, which leads to this situation. So the more we aren't doing, the more expensive they're getting, and your backlog's just growing higher.
And have you been able to quantify that yet at all, as opposed to just kind of describing?
So we haven't quantified it yet in Spokane County. In Ada County, where I worked before it was quantified, it's all one jurisdiction. So that is part of the situation, is a lot of the individual jurisdictions have quantified it. Getting a unique and one reporting system where all the jurisdictions can quantify it on a regional basis, much less a statewide basis, is something we have to continue to work on.
Okay, let's be back in 10 minutes. Since Ashley got a 5-minute question, we'll take that 5 minutes out of this time. What we're going to do now is we're going to go to a presentation by John Coster of the County Road Administration Board. I'm going to leave off with the football references. In order to save some time, I had planned a reference for each presenter, but we just don't have time for it. John, if you put your feet up here and if you'll come up and get us started and take half of the time to 11:20 and leave, well, take a little more than half because we have to take some back from John. Actually for his question.
He asked questions, so I steal a little extra gentlemen. Now, I'll try to go through this quickly. I have great appreciation for the last panel that was up here because I talked about a lot of the same things I'm going to cover here, but maybe in a little bit more detail. I want to talk a little bit about what CRAB is, who we are and what we do, and the amount of miles of roads that local government, particularly counties, maintain and take care of the 83,880 miles of state, local roads. That includes air, barge, rail, and container shipping facilities. As you can, well, I'm already behind. There we go. As you can see, counties maintain 39,180 miles of county roads. 3,300, a little over 3,300 bridges that are eligible for federal funding, and about 5,000 short span bridges which are under 20 feet and not eligible for federal funding. Those are on the county's dime, nickel, pennies, the 2 pennies they rub together, or don't have to rub together. And we also have, counties also have 4 ferry systems, believe it or not. As you can see, the breakdown in east and west, urban and rural there, the arterial collectors, local. The paved miles, 25,719, and unpaved, we have a little over 13,000 miles of unpaved roads that the counties maintain. And then you have a breakdown of the arterial collectors and the paved local. That'll be later replacement cost, if you had to replace all those roads, about $22 billion. I want to talk a little bit more about those 3,300 bridges. As you can see on there, you can look at the material types. There still have almost 300 bridges that are timber bridges. Most of those are in eastern Washington, put up by the Bureau of Reclamation when they did projects on that side of the mountains. The interesting part about that is the Bureau put concrete abutments on it, and then they put timber bridges, and they told the county that now your bridges, you have to maintain the decks, which were wood. So, thank you very much, Bureau of Reclamation. And then you look at the age of those bridges, those 3,300 bridges, and I'll break that down just a little bit more for you. See that there are a number of them that are more than 85 years old. In the condition of the bridges sufficiency rating, you can see we have around 40 of them that are in poor condition. Now I'll talk about those 3,300 bridges in a little more, that are greater than 20 feet, in a little more detail. There are also another 3,100 bridges that are under 20 feet that the counties have to take care of, not eligible. 33 of which are over 100 years of age. 103 over 85 years old, another 458 between 60 and 84 years of age. 602 bridges are listed as deficient bridges. These are listed in the Washington State Bridge Inspection as structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. These bridges become more concerned for counties given the fish passage issues in the culvert case, the expansion. These bridges are getting longer when they're replaced, and most of those short span bridges are on them counties' nickel, and so they're struggling. We also take care of what we call short span structures, of which there are about 5,000, and those are box culverts and the typical, I'm behind me, I'm talking and not watching. The typical culverts that are required, some of which will be required to be taken out and replaced. And as you see in the next slide here, one of those culverts failed up at Whatcom County. This culvert was originally a 10-foot wide by 7-foot tall structure. And as you can see, through the fish passage issues, it is now a 142-foot long bridge at the cost of $5 million. And this is not untypical of what the counties expect to face with the fish passage issues. In fact, the culvert case is probably one of the biggest concerns with the counties in the upcoming legislative session, trying to figure out how you deal with them, hopefully on a watershed basis, and how you fund replacement of culverts, which look like they're going to turn into bridges. We administer 3 grant programs. We have a direct distribution of the motor vehicle fuel tax, which goes to the counties. And then the County Road Administration Board administers what we call CAP program, the County Arterial Preservation Program. Those dollars are distributed to the counties on on a statutory formula, population, those kinds of things. And we maintain that for them. We send those numbers to the treasurer's office, and they distribute those things. We also administer the Rural Arterial Program, which is a RAP program, which is a grant program. I'll get into that in just a little bit. And we also have the County Ferry Capital Improvement Program. People are sometimes shocked that counties fund their own ferries. But currently, and the funding of those ferries, the way that works, will be coming to the legislature, Representative Fikes, for a request. One of our budget requests is for Whatcom County, Skagit County, wants to build an all-electric ferry. Save them about 39,000 gallons of diesel fuel every year. And the interesting part about those ferries is the state pays for them and then they're reimbursed, but we end up being charged, that's taken off of our distribution once a year in July, off the motor vehicle fuel tax, which it comes off the total before it's distributed to the counties through the formula, which means all the 39 counties subsidize the ferries in the 4 ferry counties. So currently that's $353,000 a year. If the Skagit request was approved, that jumps to $728,000. If Whatcom County has given every indication that they intend to come in, that'll jump to $1.2 million for a number of 4 years until one of them falls off. And that comes off the top of the county's motor vehicle fuel tax, all the counties. The CAP funds are used for payment preservation and are prioritized to roads which have the greatest needs. As I said, this is a funding formula, and those dollars, as they're spent, 80% of that goes to freight and goods routes. There's actually 2 sources there. It's motor vehicle fuel tax, and we do get $2.4 million a year annually out of the Connecting Washington legislation, which is not codified to the counties or the cities, something that we'll also bring into the attention of the legislature, because we actually program those dollars. We leverage those dollars out for years. For example, on our RAP funds, we take in about $22 million annually. So in a biennium, it's like $40-some million. But we have that leveraged out to projects in value of about $142 million. So we leverage those dollars way out. And my argument for getting that $2 million a year or 2.5 from Connecting Washington is simply, it's hard to leverage those dollars in the out years if you're not really sure you're going to have them. I just want to make a note right now, and Ashley mentioned the funding that he was able to provide for emergency. I just want to say that in our RAP, which I'm about to talk about, our RAP fund, we keep a balance in there of about $7 to $12 million, depending on how many projects, how far along projects are at the end of every fiscal year. Sometimes that gets the attention of the legislators because, well, you've got all this fund balance. But we do that for one reason. We do that in case there is a county that has an emergency that we can step up. But if we have to step up and fund that emergency, that means some other road project or safety project doesn't get done at some point, because those funds have to be replenished, most times by that county. And those dollars are programmed. So it's sort of like, we have those dollars programmed, but we're gonna take them out and pay the emergency. We gotta get them back in because we've already spent them. So we spend them twice if there's so one of the things we would like to see is a one-time appropriation in a emergency fund that we could manage and keep replenished and make it available for the counties. I think somebody mentioned the winter. I think the counties have seen some ramifications from the wildfires and the slides, and that's going to be an ongoing thing. It's not a one-time thing. In fact, I was talking to, I believe it was an Okanagan County engineer, who told me, it's not the immediate impact after the fires because the vegetation's gone. He said in the next 7 years, those trees and the roots rot off and fall over. There's nothing to hold the ground. So if you get snowfall, fast melt, or rainstorms, you're going to have even more slides. The rural arterial programs are awarded specific projects based on competitive rating. This year, we received 150 applications requesting $221 million And we have 22 million kids, so that, I can tell you, it's woefully inadequate. But these projects require a more comprehensive approach to improvement than just preservation. They have issues with alignment, other safety problems, maybe shoulders that need to be widened, or there's no shoulders there. And you see cracking. There's 3 types of projects in that fund. There's reconstruction, that's just what it sounds like. You take it down to the subgrade. There's 2R projects, which are basically resurfacing before these roads are too bad. And then, of course, if you don't get to these 2R projects, they end up being 3R projects, which includes grinding the existing surface, widening the roadway, excavation, restoration, or creation of shoulders. I got a chance to go out and look at 46 projects in the northeast region of the state. And we saw longitudinal cracking, alligator cracking, we saw the edges of the roads breaking off, we saw these roads deteriorating. And I said to my deputy director, who's an engineer, our engineers go out and look at these projects and rate them. I said, how in the Sam Hill are these counties gonna hold these roads together, even if they're chosen in the array, because they're in such poor shape? I don't know how they hold them together. So, many of these roads were not engineered and designed for the loads that they're carrying now. And you take an overall rating on our arterials, and you're gonna see those about 86. But you get to our local roads and you got a whole nother story. You got these big trucks that are harvesting potatoes out there. I was over on this side earlier last week. And they're out there with this big potato trucks running those 105.5s on those local roads that, for the most part, one day were a dirt road, and then they were a gravel road, and then somebody said we're gonna pave them, and now we have a road, right? But not with the capability of carrying the loads that are being put on them as agriculture gets bigger and bigger and they're running heavier trucks. In fact, Klickitat County, I believe yesterday, was moving a 1 million pound load on their one county road, 1 million pounds. So it was a generator for them. So anyway, rolling on here. RAP dollars, last year the counties completed 74 projects on 155 miles. There was $76 million of RATA used. So I guess our current array has 125 million, I misspoke there, for 113 projects. And one thing about CRAB is we are a first-in funder on a lot of projects. Sometimes we're the sole funder on a project as opposed to TFD or some other projects where you have to cobble dollars together to try to get a project done. And I will say at this point, I'm gonna, where am I on my thing here? I'm slow, I'm sorry, I'm behind you, folks. Anyhow, I just want to say that our funding for the motor vehicle excise tax, or fuel tax for the counties, has been virtually flat for, will be 18 years. 18 years. Will asked me a question. He was talking about, well, I'll get there in a second. I want to dwell on that just for a second. 18 years of flat funding for counties. Counties currently take in about 187 million on all the projects. Right now, through the county road portion of the property tax in the counties, it's been the only way the counties can attempt to keep up. Those dollars actually double what the counties get in motor vehicle excise, motor vehicle fuel tax. It's double. Somebody was talking in the panel, thank you for talking about the extra cost on counties. 72%, somebody told me this morning it sounded more like a policymaker. I'm a recovering legislator, so. Somebody mentioned that cost of counties, 72% of most every county's budget, general fund budget, goes to criminal justice and corrections. As the legislature continues to put more and more mandates on counties, we're seeing counties now diverting of that 400, over 400 million of the road fund property tax. We're seeing counties now diverting legally, and that's one of the things we do. We have a regulatory function as the County Road Administration Board of Standards of Good Practice. One of those is diversion of the road fund tax. Counties now are diverting 67 million and road fund portion of the property tax to meet current expense, because it can't pay the bills. That's significant. I mean, I'd like us to have that $67 million going into infrastructure, but counties are being forced to do it to make current expense. We have one county right now that's diverting 80% of their property tax, attempting to maintain their roads with only 20% of that property tax, and a little bit of MDET. In fact, the big ask for the county engineer I learned this week was he's going to go to his commissioner and say he'd like to have $80,000 back so we can actually grade the edges of the road and keep the grass off the road. That's his big ask this year to his county commissioners. So Will asked me to make sort of a spitball estimation similar to DOTs and how much is in preservation and maintenance and deferred. And years ago, the previous director, Jay Weber, said if we tripled cap and we doubled RAP, we made about half of the identified need. That was several years ago. So after spending 2 weeks on the road looking at some of these proposals, I think he's probably right on. Maybe it's even understated. County share of MDET, as I said, has been flat for 18 years. If you just did a 5% increase, that means you should take that $187 million and multiply it and add another additional 90%. And that would buy you what we had in the year 2000. I don't give you more, that you had the same buying power you had 18 years ago. And if we're only meeting half the need, it means you need to really have twice that much. So if you had twice that much and you took away the 187, we have a shortfall of just a mere $561 million a year. That sounds like a lot for 39 counties, but I gotta tell you, that's at 39,000 miles of road. It's the bridges that have deferred maintenance and need to be replaced. And it doesn't even take into account the cost of the culvert case that's coming down the road for the counties. And the expansion. You know, DOT or DOE is added to the cost as well, because now I was informed yesterday that under DOE's new regulations, where counties once had to sweep the roads once a year to keep them clean, and some of them will have to sweep as much as 6 times a year. We have 4 county ferry systems: Pierce County, Skagit County, Whatcom County, and Wahkiakum County. Talked about those just a little bit. Our dashboard, we have our dashboard up. Most of this information you can find on the dashboard. I do want to talk about public safety for just a second here before I finish up, because this is more than about nice roads. This is about public safety too. When we're short and counties can't get things done, the roads aren't any safer. For the last 5 years, from 2012 to 2016, of complete records, Washington State County roads recorded a greater fatality rate, that's fatalities per 100,000 vehicle miles traveled, than any other part of the system. Accident rates on county roads are doubled compared to state highways and city streets. And if you get out and look at some of these local roads, you can understand why that is. Okay? So the things I'd like to leave you with: we maintain 39,180 miles of road. We have 3,300 bridges that are available for federal funding, about 3,000 that aren't, and about 5,000 short span structures. We maintain 44 different ferry systems. And the funding from MDET's been flat for 4 years, and the need is continuing to grow. And that fact that accident rates are double on county roads, so there needs to be a fix. Not sure what that looks like, but there needs to be a fix. And I am grateful for the opportunity to be here, and I guess even sound like a bit of a policymaker this morning, but we got to get this done. Somehow we got to find a solution. So thank you.
I work for John part of the year, and Commissioner Cook back here is also one of my board members. So the Transportation Improvement Board, if you're not familiar with us, I like to just say we fund good projects. And our target audience by statute is all cities and the urban portion of counties. So all 281 cities, and I think 29 29 of the 39 counties qualify for funding under our programs. And to talk about this a little bit, we've been keeping pretty good records since 1990, and we just went over the 2.8 or 4,000 project mark, I believe, this year. And just to give you kind of a flavor, we're about 35 to 40% of all projects funding. In other words, we have a match. So if you're to take that $2.8 billion and double it plus a little more, that would show the actual transportation investment at a local government level that's been, that we've been a part of or partnered with. To talk about our budget, and John talked about his also, we're primarily funded through the state gas tax. It's about 3.04 cents, and a penny of gas tax is around $32 million a year. This is a biennial number. So we get about $213 million a biennium. We get a small amount from what's called the electric vehicle fee. That's growing year over year, but again, a small component of funding. And then as part of the Connecting Washington package, we received 2 additional increases to our funding. One is we got a straight $9.7 million per billion gas tax increase. And right now we're using that for our Relight Washington program, which I'll talk about in a moment. Then we got a new funding, but a new program for complete streets, and so that does not fit, or that is not assigned to our core programs. That's, like I said, a brand new program that we administer. So I've talked here, we have 5 major road programs and 2 that are aside. I was asked Molly to talk about preservation today, so I'll focus on that. But I am going to digress for a minute on Relight Washington. And what that is for cities under 5,000 population or cities with less than $2 billion in assessed value. We work with the local PUD or Vista or Puget Sound Energy to basically swap out their current lights, street lights, for LEDs. And we try to do that with a price point of around 7 years, and the lights typically last about 20 years. So you have a net savings from year 8 forward. And to give you an example, why that's important is the gas tax is an eligible category for paying for street lighting. And we're converting Grandview as we speak, and they're anticipating a $50,000 a year annual savings as a result of that conversion. Buckley, the little town of Buckley, they were one of our first adopters. Half of their gas tax allocation was going to streetlights before we made this conversion. So this is kind of like addition by subtraction, and that's why I thought it was worth calling that one out, that we're pretty proud of that program. We're about 60 or 70% complete now statewide on that. We think we've got about 3 more years before all those jurisdictions will be closed in. So that's a pretty big win for the transportation community on that particular as a result of that program. So we do have multiple programs. We do grant awards annually. $107 million is this year's board-approved amount. We have about $27 million that's targeted specifically towards preservation programs. $72 million is for our big urban arterial programs. The reason I call it the $72 million is I've had conversations with legislators over the years that said, you guys do urban projects? I thought you were just small city preservation. So I think it's really important to call that one out on occasion. So let's talk about our programs for a moment. We do require a match for our larger jurisdictions. It's a sliding scale based on the assessed value of the community, and that's our proxy of ability to pay or ability to match. And we are distributed by statute for these particular programs. So I want to talk about the arterial preservation program for a moment. They used to be when a city turned to 5,001 population, they were suddenly competing against the Seattles of the world for our urban arterial program, and naturally you just don't compete well. And so our board responded with the arterial preservation program for those cities above 5,000 but less than $2 billion in assessed values, about 60 jurisdictions. They compete among themselves for arterial preservation projects, and we find that to be a pretty successful program, and it also achieves lower unit costs for those jurisdictions. And here's what that looks like. Last year we did about 22 projects, totaling $9.2 million and 10.92 miles on that. You can find this information on our website as well on our dashboard. Our next program is our small city programs, and I put both of these together because our arterial program frequently is reconstruction of a road that's gone too far, and it does require reconstruction. And then we also have small city preservation program. And for those jurisdictions, the match is significantly less. For the most part, we're pretty much 95 to 100% fully funding those projects. And so on that end, last year, we awarded $15.6 million, about 27 projects, and again, 7.65 miles. That may not seem like a lot, but for a small town that's only a half a mile long or 3/4 mile long, that's pretty much the whole main street in a lot of situations. One of the things that we do, and this practice started as a result of the 2005 transportation package, is we do administer the Small City Preservation Program. And that's about, for all cities under 5,000, it's about 1,500 miles. So think City of Spokane. Spokane's got about 1,500 miles. We basically are helping manage the equivalent of a city that size. And we do what we call windshield analysis. We review 25% of the system every year to look at its pavement condition. And so we try to cycle through every 4 years. And we've had a target of slowly getting each jurisdiction up to an average pavement rating of 70. So if you were to go to our dashboard, you would see all the counties here. You could highlight each county, and then based on that, you would see each jurisdiction and projects that we funded there and how we're incrementally trying to make progress on the pavement condition ratings. And we've made significant progress in almost every jurisdiction. There's some components or segments that are just so far gone that they're at the bottom of the list because it would exhaust our program. Again, we'd like to keep up with the ones we've got. But if you go to our website, you would see each small town with these, each segment and our pavement condition ratings. And so when they apply to us or when we're targeting funding, we have a pretty good sense of where we're putting our funds and does it make sense. And we've been working from kind of the downtown cores out to target our funds as far as that works. So on that particular program, we put $6.5 million into it. Last year we got 23.8 miles. This year, interestingly, we've had fewer applications than we've had in years past. We're still sorting that out. We're not entirely sure if it's, we used to get towns that would submit, say, 4 applications for 6 miles. And we kind of said, just send us 1 application for 6 miles and let us sort it out to kind of save us a little bit of work. Because every time we receive a grant application, we field review every single one. So we had 300 applications this year, and we've been doing field reviews on 300 projects before we make an ultimate recommendation to award. So I wanted to talk about staff observations for a moment, and this was touched on earlier today. Some of the things we've always heard when we're seeking more funding is first thing you need to do is build a more perfect mousetrap. Be more efficient with the funds that you have, and we think we've already done a pretty good job on that. Then the other one is find other funding. You know, be involved in your own rescue before seeking funds from the legislature or elsewhere. And then the other one, of course, is raise money. I spend most of my time fundraising, and I can share with you that 70% of my day-to-day work is sitting down with a public works director, city manager, or mayor, focusing on a financial strategy for larger projects, because it usually takes multiple partners to do anything over a couple of million dollars to get to yes on a project. So I want to talk about the elephant in the room, and John talked about it a little bit himself. And that is, our current funding is just frankly not sustainable. As John talked about for the County Road Administration Board, I did a look back for us, and you can see our gas tax distributions from 2015 compared to 1997-99. Those are actual dollars, 222 versus 213, and we had the $4 million increase for our small city preservation program. So we're really about, if you wanted apples to apples, we're $218 million versus $213 million. We all know what the cost of construction has been over the past 20 plus years. And that's why that additional increase of $9.7 million is so mission critical for us, just to even begin to keep up with demands of our customers. And then I also wanted to kind of put this in context a little bit. Because our book of business is mostly cities, I took a look at how do we partner with cities and how do we get to yes for funding just the network. Well, cities receive about $23 per capita of state shared revenues, that's gas tax and a little bit of multimodal. They're responsible for 17,000 miles, and again, it's divvied up by population or multiplied times population. So they get about $110 million, $111 million a year. And if you were to take their network and put it on a 20-year or a 15-year paving cycle just for preservation, Those would be the amount of funds they would have available to maintain their system if they just use state money. Well, then I crosswalked it with our actual cost per mile, and you can see that that's just not going to get you to yes on that end. And that's why partnership with Transportation Improvement Board, developer funds, etc., is how you get your system funded. Then I took the second step. We've talked about transportation benefit districts quite a bit, and they've caught fire. There's about 100 of them now, and latest data shows that about 82 million has been collected statewide. So pretending it's just flexible money statewide, that would add another $100,000-ish per mile, but again, you're short. So there are some big tools out there, but it also explains why local jurisdictions are constantly scrambling for funds to take care of their network, or frankly, they're just falling behind. So I wanted to talk about some observations and what's been working well. When we started the Small City Preservation Program, we partnered with the counties and Department of Transportation, where before the paver would hit the city limits, from the county, lift up, go through town, and drop back down. Now, because of a lot of those partnerships, you pave right through the city, and we've taken huge advantage of bulk rates. And that's allowed us to extend our dollars significantly further. We're also we're targeting 2 or 3 cities that are nearby and asking one city to be the lead and trying to bundle projects that way for small-scale paving projects. That's particularly important in northeastern Washington, where you have like Kettle Falls and those areas, to see if they can partner together. And then the other thing that we're doing as an internal management thing is we're limiting late bids. If you come to me pretty much at the end of June asking to do work by later this summer, I'm going to tell you no, or saying that any cost increases you have to bear on your own. And because typically we're such a large partner, without our additional funding, they're out. So that's just been some of the cost containment things that we've been making a huge, huge point of emphasis on. Challenges, as John shared, we think that if we're adequately serve small cities, we should double that program. Regulatory environment, ADA, John's got his culverts, we've got ADA, and stormwater costs are significantly higher. The definition of preservation is broad. Selecting the right types of treatments for the right jurisdiction is very, very important. We try very hard to guard against over-engineering what should be done in a small community. And then the other one is many ordinances are very ancient for cities that support really wide streets. And our viewpoint is that residential streets should start to narrow, because the second time you pave, it would be that much cheaper. So some opportunities, and Representative Fye knows this well. Transportation is a daily problem, and if there is additional funding available, take advantage of the political environment. We'll continue to work on county-city agreements. I brought up in the previous channel where Will said I stole 5 minutes. One of the things we learned from that emergency repair program is that of the 90 jurisdictions that participated, about 6 said, hey, you took care of our problem, we're not going to apply this year, or we're going to wait 2 years to apply. So we're going to look at maybe skimming a little bit off of our traditional program and do more crack seal and run-of-the-mill treatments to kind of push that cost curve out and take care of our jurisdictions that way. I mentioned narrowing residential streets. That's a continuous challenge, and I was talking to one of my staff, and we're working with a city where the intersection was established at the time that you had to turn the stagecoach around in order to move through town. So the intersection is gigantic, and so we're trying to negotiate with that city. Maybe it's okay to put curb bulb outs and skinny the street a little bit rather than focus on pavement. But that just kind of brings it home to real. The other one is assigning costs, and the reason I put this one in here, and this is a little different than a couple of weeks ago, is that I've noticed or observed over the years there's creep with each program, meaning, oh, we'll put it in preservation, we'll put it in our improvement program, rather than looking at, are we starting to get away from our true self of what is a preservation project? So the example I would give is that when we do preservation or road paving projects, we now touch the curb, and that triggers ADA requirements. And that's absolutely important, and that's the right thing to do. But maybe we should specifically assign ADA for what it is and make that its own decision package and its own investment package, so that we can maybe parse that out or focus on where we can get additional revenue. So I think that one's really important that we think about as a community. And then lastly, and I talked about this one a couple of weeks ago, before Initiative 695, and I used to be, John said he's reformed legislator, I guess I'm reformed legislative staff. We used to have a rule of thumb that whenever there was new lane miles added to the transportation system, we'd set aside about 5% in future transportation budgets to accommodate or acknowledge that there's new maintenance and preservation requirements. And when Initiative 695 blew $800 million out of the budget with 1 year to go in the biennial budget, all that stuff went by the wayside. And I hope that maybe we can start reinstating that kind of concept that when there's the next connecting Washington, there's an automatic formula that just bakes in preservation and maintenance needs and costs so that we're not in this constant tension of, hey, we just built all this new stuff, but we can't maintain it. So that's kind of where we're at with Transportation Improvement Board and a couple of my thoughts on that. And Will, I haven't looked on time, so I want to make sure.
We're actually a little over, so let me ask you a question.
Sure. Yeah.
Roger Millar has given us a $550 million deficiency per year for the state system. Some of us think that's a little bit low, but nobody thinks it's too high. And your colleague gave us a spitball, which is the right thing to ask for, at the county level of another, was it 561?
Yep.
Do you have a spitball, or if you don't have a spitball for the city needs, could you say whether or not you think it's in the same range as the 550 and the 561?
Oh, I don't know, it's probably higher, just because there's more miles.
You think it's what?
It might be higher just because there's more miles.
Okay.
And let me talk about that for a second, because we as a transportation community, and I experience this a lot in the environmental community, we spend years and millions of dollars on studies assessing a backlog. And I think it's important to have a sense of scale of it, but not spend millions of dollars getting down to the penny. I think it's more important that we focus on, we have X number of miles and a rough estimate of X to get us whole, but really talk about what are the next set of investments we can responsibly achieve in the next 2 years, 6 years, and 10 years, given our workforce, our ability to ramp up and to deliver. And I think that's more realistic for us as a transportation community. And I think that's more palatable in city, county, and legislative environment to say if we get X, we can deliver this and bring ourselves up to a certain standard. Rather than, oh, we'll study it for another 2 years, burn $2 or $3 million in consultant time, and the hole's just that much bigger. And that's a personal bias I have, but having been around the axle on that, I'd rather just keep it at the large 100,000 foot scale for deficit and need, but really focus on how we can do the next set of investments.
So
that's an editorial line.
And I appreciate that editorial because your expertise is obviously great. The one thing I'd like to ask you about your benefit district presentation, which we're not going to have time for in order to give Mike his full 40 minutes. We had a comment this morning from Walla Walla, from Andrea, that there's a 20-year time limit on these things and that it's going to go away. Could that problem be solved with a legislative fix?
Yeah, so let me, I'll just joke that people have told me that when I buy the farm, TBD is going to be in my headstone because I've spent so many years on transportation benefit districts. And what's being referred to is, and I'll just click through to the slide and speak to it real quickly, is what happened?
Oh, don't go.
Okay. When transportation benefit districts were created, you've heard the MPO panel wax poetic about how city funds are mostly taken up by cops and firefighters, which is true. When transportation benefit districts were created, one of the components, and you'll see it up in the top there, is the sales and use tax. And Will, to your question, when TBDs were first created, the 2/10 of a sales tax was a prior authority from 1987, and it was voter approved only. Then it was restructured, and then initially it said that it could only be 10 years and was a mandatory sunset without going back for another vote of the people. So where it stands today is if you're bonding it, you can extend it for 20 years. If you're just accepting it as a cash receipt, you have to renew every 10 years, but at the end of 20 years, it's finite. It's sunset completely. So that should be something that should be looked at to possibly be repealed because of that concern.
to say, I really appreciate you doing this, and I'm really sorry that.
Oh, it's okay.
But,
I'm around, people can ask questions.
oh, okay,
So,
and what we'd like to do now is, I want to make sure that we give Mike, who's been working on this presentation, his full 40 minutes, and we'll just take it out of lunch if you don't get done. So, come on up, Mike, and we'll get you set up. Mike, by the legislature and what is centrally administered in Medicaid, down to the 6 regions. I would have said some nice things about Todd, but he went to WSU, so I can't. But the thing is that these are really impressive people, and I really appreciate what Mike is going to give us today, because he's going to talk to us about a bridge situation and some other things.
Thank you, Will. So, I hate to be sandwiched in right before lunch, or everybody gets hungry, puts paying attention when we get close to the dinner bell, but what I hope to do over the next few minutes is actually sort of tell you a story. I'm a big believer that people connect with storytelling, that they understand things by connecting to it more on a personal level. So I'm hoping in this conversation, over the next few minutes, that you'll feel free to ask me questions as we go along, because I want to give you a chance to ask your questions. And then I hope you connect with the preservation story that DOT is working through. It is where we are right now, and that's what we're going to talk about. So you have to start the story with the checkbook, right? And so what I wanted to do was sort of set up how funding looks at DOT, and I actually took this from the secretary. We've been having quite a few conversations about how to talk about funding at DOT, because it's a very complicated question. And so the secretary, through conversations with all of us, decided to sort of slice this in a couple places and make some comparisons. So if we look at all of the available funding in the gas tax that is available to everyone, what you see up there is in 2018, you see 8 cents for preservation, safety, and maintenance. You see 12 cents going to the locals. You see 11.4 cents that is directed by the legislature, so we have no control of that. And you see debt service at 18 cents, or 37% of the wheel. If we speak out to 2029 and we project this, it looks a little bit different. So we've mostly used up the directed investments from the legislature. We still have 12 cents going to the locals. We still have 8 cents going to safety, preservation, and maintenance. But the debt service now is at 54%. So we're starting to have a significant amount of debt load to carry in our cash flow. If we just look at DOT, if we just say, well, okay, let's take a look at DOT's ability to respond to the state system and preservation, it even looks a little bit darker. So again, in 2018, you see we're really already at about half of our cash flow is tied up in debt service. We have the 8 cents we talked about, and 11.4 cents is directed to us from the legislature. And in 2029 now, what we see is DOT's checkbook now is 71% dedicated to debt service. We're down to the 2.9 cents and the 8 cents. So a full 71% of our budget in 2029 is paying off debt. So I don't know how many of you would like to have that budget at home, but I don't. And so along with understanding the budget, I want to share with you sort of what you own. What does the public own? So when we talk about preserving stuff, what is it that we're preserving? So roughly you, the taxpayers, own nearly 19,000 miles of highway lane miles, over 3,300 bridges, 22 ferries, one which is in eastern region, the Keller Ferry, 32 transit systems, 16 operated, DOT-operated airports, and then some dedicated bike lanes and some dedicated sidewalk. And I want to show you this because the blue bar that I showed you on the circle that was legislative directed funding really is these projects right here. That was a significant piece of the Connecting Washington project, or of the funding package. But that's what's slowly disappearing over time. As we build those projects, those convert from money invested to debt service. That's what's happening in the out years. So one of the things the secretary did, and we, I think, all appreciated it because it gives us some real significant talking points, is he asked the agency to put a price tag on what we own. What is the value of what the public owns in the state of Washington on the state highway system? Well, it comes, now this may be a bit conservative because I think the secretary was trying to be careful, but it comes out to be nearly $120 billion of assets that we must own, that we must maintain. Now, Will has talked about this, I've heard him say it 3 or 4 times, but I want to cover it again. When you add up the average spending, 10-year average spending, the 10-year future spending, and the additional needs, that's where you get to this number where we are about half funded for the preservation needs that we actually have. So we're losing ground to the needs of preservation and the DOT system at about $500 million of biennium. So that conversation's out there. You guys have probably already heard this. What is interesting to folks like me and to Todd and others that are managing the system are the questions we get asked around it. And the questions we typically get, the 2 main ones that I hear about are, okay, so we know you got a shortfall. How are you managing that shortfall? What does that look like to manage that much deficit? And then the other question we get asked is, well, what does that look like in the field? When I'm driving along, what does that look like? When I see something, is that part of this preservation shortfall? So I want to take a few minutes and kind of walk you through what those 2 questions lead to for answers as far as DOT is concerned. And I will tell you, what I'm going to share with you is just a couple stories and some stuff that I know in Eastern Region, but this is going on in everybody's region. It is not a new story to anybody at DOT. This is just stuff that I'm familiar with. So the first question, let's talk about what we're doing about it. And so nice round numbers. Let's drill down just a little bit. And let's talk about, in nice round numbers, the lane miles that we own. Just to replace the surfacing, just to deal with the surfacing you drive on is $15 billion. That's about what it's worth. So that's really the scope of the preservation on the roadway surface that we're trying to grapple with every funding cycle. And so that leads us to stuff like this. This is what we actually see out there on that 18,500 miles of investment that you own and that $15 billion worth of surface that you drive on. A lot of it is in this condition. And so what we have been asking ourselves is, with half enough money, how can we, we're a problem-solving agency, how can we do something about this inside of the budget constraints we already have? That led us to a policy, which I happen to be involved in, that, and I will tell you, so have you guys heard about our practical solutions stuff? Are you guys familiar with that? Okay. So this was probably the largest practical solution that I personally was involved in that had the most impact on the state system and on our budget. So I know you can't read that, but I want you to know what the policy is. It is a pavement management policy that directs the agency, people like Todd and I, when we're managing our assets, to do at least one maintenance touch on the roadway before we can invest in a full repair. And so what we found out, and here's the meat of that I want you to get out of the policy. What we found out is, even though we were operating in the lowest life cycle, it was possible for us to take more risk and lower the life cycle a little bit more to stretch our dollars, defer capital investments, and give us the opportunity to prioritize higher needs. And so when you're driving around and you're asking yourself, what does that look like? What did DOT do to accomplish that? If you've been in my region, you've seen many, many places where there's strips of pavement right in the wheel tracks. You've seen that everywhere, right? Okay, those strips of pavement are this asset management policy in motion. What we're doing is recognizing that the need that is generated to that section of roadway, the reason we're considering repairing it, is a wheel pass. If we spend a lot less money, put some money in the wheel pass, we can defer the overall capital investment a couple years, sometimes 4 or 5 years, and we can defer the bigger expenditure to a more significant need. That doesn't mean we're not gonna have to come back here, but the idea behind the policy is that we don't create a different outcome. So we push the timeline out, but the solution is still the same. And if that actually happens, what you have done is deferred capital investments in a way that you can free up money to work on higher priorities. Yes?
In percentage terms, how much does that save you doing just those 2 strips versus the whole?
It can be very significant, and so it's a little hard for me to give you a hard number, but let me tell you how we look at this. We look at a section of pavement every 1/10 of a mile, and we ask ourselves, is that ready for repair or not? So that's what we consider to be a due mile or a mile that's not due. So every 1/10 of a mile, if there's enough 1/10 of a mile that add up to a project, we would normally, under the old system, repay the whole thing. So in this case, let's say there's a 5-mile project, and 2 miles of it looks like what I showed you in the other screen that had the bad section in the wheel tab. If we come in and repair that, we can move the due miles out 2 or 3 years and just defer the capital investment. And sometimes we can do those cost adjustments for as little as 5 to 10% of the original capital or the anticipated capital investment. So I will tell you this, in the first biennium that we put this into motion in Eastern Region, we deferred $54 million worth of investments. So it's a significant issue. Now, there's other things that we do in this. We do crack sealing, we do patching. There's other things that get us to this place. But what I want you to know is that, and I want you to recognize, is that there has been a lot of activity at a corporate level within the agency to find ways around the budget shortfall to make it work. But it introduces a lot of risk to the system. So we are also creating a program like this in the bridge, around our bridge preservation. It is being modeled after our pavement policy. It is a little less mature, so I'm going to just share with you that we're doing it. It is starting to have some impacts, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the state of our bridges. So if you look at this chart, and we're talking just in deck area here, we're just talking about decks. We're back on roadway surface. You can see the ages of our decks, how much bridge deck area is associated with it. Our bridges are getting old, right? And you heard that from everybody else that was up here talking. You know, they're starting to deal with the fact that their stuff is just old. So in DOT's case, we currently own 266 bridges that are at least 80 years old. That's $2.7 billion worth of investment right there. Okay, those are your actual service life when you're in those timelines, and we're extending the service life of these bridges because we can't afford to fix them. So when you're driving around, what's the shortfall look like? And I think what I wanted to share with you guys, and I think this is really, really important, there's a lot more going on in this conversation than just what does it take to preserve the system. There is real pain in the preservation decisions that are made, in the trade-off decisions that DOT has to make. And I want to walk you through a couple projects where this hopefully is evident to you. So, anybody here familiar with the Kettle Falls Bridge? Barney Junction? Okay. So that's the bridge when it was being built. It was built, I think, in 1951. Spans the river. So think about it for a minute. If you're familiar with the area, where's the closest crossing to Kettle Falls?
All right.
The ferry is, that's the southerly crossing, Keller Ferry. On the state system, it's Keller Ferry. Northport. So if this bridge is out of service, do you think that impacts people? So this bridge deck in 2012 surfaced to us as basically an emergency. Now, we knew this bridge deck was getting bad. We had been having discussions about programming a bridge project for years. You can see we were putting plates of steel down, all kinds of tricks, every trick we could think of to keep the bridge open. It's a low ADT route. It wasn't surfacing in the bridge priority. There was at one point in the conversation, I'm gonna plant this seed with you, there was at one point in the conversation, in the programming conversation, where we were thinking this was gonna cost us $700,000-$800,000 to take care of this bridge deck. In 2012, this started happening, and we couldn't stop it. We started getting holes in the deck that were coming through the bottom of the deck. Our patches wouldn't hold. The steel plates were making us very uncomfortable. Bridge didn't think they were gonna hold. We reached a place where we had essentially an emergency. And so we had to program a project, or we had to shut down the bridge. Now, by waiting so late, and this is the challenge we have in the trade-off decisions that we make, by waiting so late, okay, we added a whole bunch of costs to the project. There was no way we were gonna repair this bridge deck without going through the bridge deck in numerous places. When we put the hydro demolisher on the deck, it was gonna blow the bridge deck out from the top to the bottom in many places. That's how bad it had become. So as most of you know, environmental permitting being what it is, we had to capture 100% of whatever came off of that bridge deck. So one of the things that came out of waiting too long is we had to build a full containment system under the full length of that bridge, so absolutely nothing got in the river. Had we done it when we originally thought it was due, we would have been able to do this without going through the deck and without the containment system. The other thing that leads you to is with that many blowouts and that lack of reliability in the condition of your deck, you're putting people on a detour. You're gonna close that bridge for some of the work. Now, we just talked about how far away the other crossings were. So the detour route for Kettle Falls Bridge, when we did it, was about 2 hours. Now, if you happen to live there, if you lived on the wrong side of the bridge and you needed to go get a gallon of milk, you're not too particularly happy with us. That's the pain I'm talking about that people realize in these trade-off decisions. Once we have to figure out, we get to a place where we're sort of in an emergency situation and we just have to step in and deal with it. Again, if we could have done this earlier, if we'd have the resources to do this deck earlier, we'd probably been, well, we would have not had the detour route because we wouldn't have had to completely close the bridge, and we certainly wouldn't have had a containment system. That ended up costing us a little over $1.7 million. 2/3 of that cost, half of it at least, maybe up to 2/3 of that cost, was simply because we waited too long. That's just the truth of it. All right, so now let's talk about the Northport Bridge. Where's the closest bridge to the Northport Bridge? Kettle. That was a trick question. So the Northport Bridge was built in 1941. Now, we keep a good eye on these bridges. We have, every 2 years, we have qualified bridge inspectors that come out and look at our bridges. We had no idea that we had a problem at Northport. In 2012, Northport was our savior. We used it to detour freight. It was where we put everything. In 2016, I get a call from the director of bridge. He says, you need to send your folks out there and close Northport Bridge. I said, what? He says, now, send them out now. And so I sent everybody out to close the bridge. So I'm going to tell you this story. But to tell you this story, I need you to sort of understand how this bridge functions, okay? So it is actually constructed in 2 different types. And so we're not interested in the type over here. What we're interested in is the steel truss, okay? So the way this particular steel truss works is as you drive on this bridge and you get into the center span, you put a vertical load on the bridge. That load rotates around these 2 points, and that creates uplift on the end of the bridge. So can you kind of imagine that? Okay. So that uplift on the end of the bridge is resisted by bridge anchors that are bolted to the abutments and hold the bridge down. So I also want to kind of give you this picture. If you drive across this bridge and that uplift happens and those bolts don't hold, the bridge folds up and it goes in the water. That's how a catastrophic failure would happen on that bridge. So, our bridge folks, what they finally told me after they pulled me off the ceiling about closing the bridge, is they had been up there earlier in the year and they had inspected it out. They looked at the bolts right here that anchor the bridge down. And you can see they're a little bit rusty. They look like they're intact. But they came back a couple months later with an x-ray machine and they x-rayed them. And I went, oh no, there's nothing left here. And so as we sandblasted them to discover what they had found in the x-ray, this is what we discovered. We had tension bolts that were, some of them less than 30% of the diameter they originally were designed to be. And there was real danger that the wrong load would have catastrophically collapsed that bridge. So now, if you've been to Northport sits on both sides of the river. There's a lot of the town on both sides of the river. Pretty hardy folks up there. When we called them and told them we were closing the bridge and why, they were very patient with us. But this was really stressful for them. They couldn't get their kids to school. They couldn't get emergency services around. It's happened to be in the middle of the winter. Those detour routes that I shared with you, well, they were under snow. They were under load restrictions. Any freight coming into the United States at that point had to be deferred through to a different international boundary. There was no place for them to come across. So there was a pretty significant event there at least for the local folks and for the local freight haulers. So I told you we're kind of a problem-solving agency, and we were really struggling with this bridge closure because it was going to be several months before we were going to be able to fix this bridge. It was going to be probably March. We were looking at this in January, December and January. It was going to be March or April before we got to a fix. And so as we started looking at this, we had the bridge closed, and we kept talking to folks up there. We actually had a discussion with Bridge about some what-if scenarios, because we were trying to figure out how to at least keep the bridge open somehow. What we figured out is, and Bridge let us do, is if we stacked enough weight on the end of the bridge, we could simulate the tension bolts that would have held the bridge in place. And so if we put enough weight on there and put in speed limits and put in a signal system, they would let us open the bridge to one lane and let people traverse the bridge. But there had to be strict adherence to the speed limit. Now, when I called the mayor of Northport and talked to some of the folks up there and said, can you help us adhere to the speed limit? They're like, if you can open up the bridge, we will patrol it. And so they were very, very grateful. So what was going to be more of a significant concern, we actually found a way to mitigate. But these are real concerns for these folks. I mean, I'm trying to plan in your head that the amount of pain that comes with the understanding of the problems that we are creating by waiting too long on doing maintenance. So there's what it looks like at the end when we put the new bolts in. Everything's fine. The bridge is working normally again. But there's another $500,000 that we weren't anticipating in our preservation budget, simply because, quite frankly, the bridge is getting old. Now, this conversation, like I said, is going on in every region. I think Todd could tell you a dozen stories just like this. North Central has the same problem. And the trade-off conversation that DOT gets brought into on this is really challenging for us, because like I said, where you end up in this conversation is you make decisions about, there's winners and losers in this, is the bottom line. And the longer we defer maintenance and we use asset management tools that look at ADT and that kind of thing, we're shoving that pain out to the rural areas. All right, so the last thing I feel absolutely obligated to talk about is system additions and maintenance in terms of how our maintenance folks operate. So system additions, I showed you the chart, all the big projects. We have one in Spokane, North Spokane corridor. We're very, very happy that the legislature legislature funded it. We're excited to have that project. But like many systems additions, it did not come with any maintenance funds. So on the North Spokane corridor alone, that's 60 new lane miles. Those 60 new lane miles would typically require 2 people and 2 trucks and some other equipment to properly maintain. Okay, we don't have those trucks or those people or that equipment. And so we are continually stretching our resources, our maintenance folks, to maintain stuff. And I have no doubt you're starting to see lapses in our maintenance. You might come out on a road one day when it's not actually plowed as early as normal. We don't have enough stuff. Not only do we not have enough stuff, the stuff we have is getting very old. As you might imagine, doing snow plowing in eastern Washington and treating the roads with chemicals for several months at a time is really, really hard on equipment. We have AR vehicles, which are already retired vehicles, that we have kept in our fleet because we have no mechanism to increase the fleet and no mechanism to replace trucks with new ones. We have some of them in our fleet that are 20 years old. They're 20 years old and they've been doing this work. They're highly corroded. They're very hard to keep on the road. We don't have enough mechanics to keep them on the road, and the mechanic burden is much higher because the trucks break down a lot more. There's simply no contingency in the system anymore. The maintenance system is stressed to the max. If a truck goes down, something doesn't get done. There's no spare trucks, there's no spare people. We are really at a place where you're gonna start to feel it. And so I did have a chance, I see Senator Holmes is here, I had a chance to pitch this to him earlier today. This is a very important issue to us. This is the same discussion that we are having about preservation of the roadways from a maintenance perspective, and it's just as important as the capital investment. It is just as important to keep the system up and running. So, with that, I've walked through it, I think almost on time, so I would take a few questions if Will will let me. Yes, sir.
Mike, we've heard several times last night and during the course this morning the fish culprits and the impact that's having potentially into the future here for the state DOT budget. What happens currently in the budget and where's the funding going to be coming from to address that?
That is a great question. So, we typically have been spending about $25 million a year on fish passage. When the injunction happened, we, I think, pushed it up to around $90 or $95 million because we saw this train wreck coming. When we lost this latest court injunction suit that took place, where we were directed by a judge basically to complete an additional 425 fish passages and 1,000 miles of habitat by 2030. That decision equates to $3.7 billion, I believe it is, and somewhere around $600 million of biennial expenditures. There's, at this point, I mean, I speak to the legislators that are here, at this point, there's not a plan on how to fund that. If you're looking at the existing system, that's what you're gonna draw that $600 million out of. That would completely evaporate the preservation program. It would just destroy it if we're actually funding from that level.
Could you repeat those numbers, please?
$3.7 billion, 425, that I'm aware of, 425 directed culverts that we have to repair, and 1,000 miles of habitat. So somewhere, if you just do the math in your head, I just kind of did it in my head real quick, that's somewhere around $600 million buy-in-ish.
And I believe Ashley Crowbar had shared that a cent gets you about 32 million. So do the math, you got 8 cents in the green, 8 times 32 million equals, and yet you've got to fund what Mike just said.
Or you could bond it for about $500 million and pay for it for the next 30.
It is the, I mean, we have a lot of stress in our preservation conversation. This is a whole different discussion. I mean, this is, it's very scary, actually.
And this is just the state portion.
This is just DOT. Okay, you heard from others that they have the same, I mean, it's hanging over their head as well. So, but this is just what we know about in DOT and just in our budget. Yes, sir.
When I was young in Spokane, we paid a toll to cross the bridges around here, and I'm so old that most of the route probably doesn't remember, but the west side's going to tolls in many, many locations. Is that the answer, or part of the answer for the east side?
It's a real challenge on the east side because you have to be able to capture the AET. And there's an interesting phenomenon that happened on the Maple Street toll bridge when we took the toll off. The volumes went way up. And so one of the challenges we've looked at tolling on like the North Spokane corridor and other places. We're a little fearful of it because we can't really capture the traffic. And what we're afraid we're gonna do is disperse it to the local network because they won't pay the tolls. And that's not really where we wanna go, that's just moving the problem somewhere else.
So in eastern Washington, diversion occurs when you toll.
Oh, absolutely.
We had that discussion in western Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's, in my opinion, it's much worse here. There's a higher aversion to paying the toll, and there's less congestion here. It's harder to capture the AET. So, I mean, it is something we can talk about, but it's not a real practical answer at this point.
And when that diversion happens, where does it go? What system does it go into?
Well, generally, the way flow diagrams work with traffic is it goes to the shortest trip, but in the state highway system here, it's gonna go to the city and county road system. And so we're just taking our regional traffic and now creating a burden for the cities and the counties. And I don't think that's actually what we want to do.
So I just want to put out, in the city of Bellevue, for instance, we have I-405 that goes north-south, it's congested 6 hours a day. The city of Bellevue has a street called South Bellevue Way that's parallel and intersects with I-90. And we, as a city of Bellevue, are talking about a $30 million mile-and-a-half section of HOV lane to solve the problem on our local city street that is directly connected to the congestion on 405 and the tolls that are being on 405. So we're looking at as a local jurisdiction to spend $30 million, in my mind, on a project that's driven by the transit system, the sound transit, that's why it's all there, but it's also in support of the lack of funding of the 405 corridor, which has had a 20-year master plan.
Yeah, and you know, you just cannot deny the fact that this stuff is related. We have these conversations often on the MPO board. I don't know if Al's still here, but the governance of this, you know, the people that live in Eastern Region, they don't care whose road it is, right? They don't know if it's a city or a state road. They go where the traffic isn't or where they can get a reliable trip. So one of the things that we talk about often is there, you know, can we start to think about transportation funding, and can we think about these solutions in a much more regional way? You know, where is the best place to spend the money to solve the problem? Maybe it's not on the state system. Maybe the investment in your city street is the right answer, but how do you bring money to that? How does DOT participate in that conversation? How do we help you fund that project if it helps 405? And I think that conversation has got legs, in my opinion. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Well, I think that Mike may have killed some of our appetites, so if we just toed up quickly before we go to lunch, we have Roger Millard telling us we need another $550 million a year for preservation and maintenance. We have Crab telling us they need 561. We've got Ashley saying that they need more for cities. And now we have this issue of the additional maintenance that's necessary by additional roads. It's brought up at the state level by Mike and brought up at the city level by Ashley. The fact of the matter is we're talking about a deficiency of a couple $2 billion a year I was not real good at math, but pretty much a couple $2 billion a year, if you round it. And if Ashley's right, that a penny is worth 32 cents.
32 million.
32 million, you divide that into a couple billion, and that's more than a nickel gas tax. So, let's go have some lunch. Joe, which room is it gonna be in?
Where we had breakfast.
Okay, back to the breakfast room, and then we'll be back here, to hear from our two legislators who are both in the room and have a chance to hear. Thank you so much.
Man, so much.
We've heard at some length this morning about the problem and the dimensions of the problem. And we know that part of the solution, a big part of the solution is going to be money. And we have the privilege of having with us today the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, Steve Hobbs, and the vice chair of the House Transportation Committee, Jay Fly. And I want us to make sure that we have an opportunity to hear what they have to say. Senator Hobbs needs to leave at a certain point to catch his plane back to the west side. So, without further ado, Senator Hobbs, why don't you take this away?
Sure. You guys want more money for maintenance and preservation, right? Did I get that right? Yeah, I think I got that message. Don't have a lot of money. You know, in the 2015 package, it's good and bad. Good that we actually put maintenance and preservation in a transportation package. Bad because we didn't put it all. Right? Put $100 million in maintenance and $1.222 billion in preservation, which sounds like a lot of money until you go, oh, it's over a 16-year period. Right? So, not a lot. It's hard to get packages like this passed because in order to get the votes, you have to offer up a project or two to members. It's hard to sell maintenance and preservation to a member for votes. This is where you come in, you can try to sell it to them. I think the only way to overcome these deficits is we're going to need another transportation package, which I'm going to attempt to do, at least on the Senate side, to do another transportation package. But I will tell you this, and the thread is out there, this is just my opinion, so showing tribute to my caucus, or Jake here, but my opinion is if the people pass that carbon initiative, I will not be able to do any transportation package, or it'll be very difficult for me to do that. Because it is essentially a gas tax increase of around the 12 to 15 cent range. We can argue on the numbers, but it will be a gas tax. It goes into a fund, it goes into some fund which is managed by a group of individuals that really are not part of the legislature, and they appropriate. Now, buried in there is some transportation related stuff, but nothing about maintenance and preservation, and quite frankly, they don't have to do anything in there. They could totally ignore any of the transportation aspects of this fund. I think it's also dangerous when you look in there and it says, the funding will be used to, job worker retraining on jobs lost from this carbon initiative, so I don't think that's very promising. What I would propose if I do a transportation package is I'll do 5 cents, a $7.50 carbon, I will have carbon on there, a statewide impact fee, I know people don't like that either. But the idea of that is taking that money, the impact fee money, and plowing it back into cities and counties, and organizations that deal with kind of road and county. So CRAB would be one. We would divert a bunch into maintenance preservation for DOT. Because I've heard you, I know Jake has heard you when it comes to maintenance and preservation. I've seen the nice pictures. I guarantee you Millar has pounded in my head multiple times. And I get it. And I'm going to try to do that if I get this package out. I'm going to need your help to do that, because it's not easy. Because on my side of the aisle, they don't like building roads. On the other side of the aisle, they hate raising taxes. So it's going to be a huge challenge. But we need to do this. The 2015 package, great. Did a lot of great things. But there's still a lot of needs in there. And this is a way to move the state forward. And I think it's a positive factor for our state economy. And I'm going to try to push it as hard as I can. The other issue is, and you brought it up, is the culverts. It's $3.7 billion. On the state side, there's a city and county aspect to this that, guess what? You think they can pay for it? No, they can't pay for it. And then on top of that, there's the issue of, do you just do the state culverts and do you solve the problem of, fish runs? No, you don't. You need to expand fish habitat. The only way to do that is through watershed, which means you have to have the cities and counties involved in this. So I don't want to chew up a lot of time and do gloom and doom here, but there's hope. But yeah, that carbon initiative needs to fail, and I need your help passing a transportation package next year. All right, Jake, go ahead.
Well, thank you for the setup. I'll start by thanking folks here for inviting me over on the presumption that I might have something to do with transportation next year. I'm currently the vice chair, and the chair is not running for re-election. So, but I counted it out. I think I've been over, since the session ended, I've been in Eastern Washington 7 times. All but one related to transportation. And so I had the good fortune of speaking with the folks in the Tri-Cities area last month, and I appreciated the courtesy that was extended, and I got a great tour. I didn't get any wine to take back, but I had a great tour. So the senator is, I guess I'm going to say it this way. I don't think the senator has anything to worry about on the carbon tax, because I don't think it's going to pass. So, yeah, that is without stating, because actually, I had to get scripted to be here. My script had to be approved by the House attorney to make sure that it wasn't political. So that was not a political comment. That was a comment on my judgment about what the electric will do. And I'll have to say I'm an unabashed environmentalist in that I've worked in the environmental field, in the energy area, my whole work career, more about incenting people to doing things than taxing people to do things. So I do believe we need to address the climate issue. I have a different, if I was to write the initiative, I would have written it differently. But that wasn't for me to write that initiative, and we'll see how that all plays out. That'll be whatever it is at the end of the day. So let me just say, I don't know what's going to happen if I stray away from these 25 pages of script, except before I know that I don't have much hair on my head, and when Senator Hobbs gets through listening to my 20-minute speech, I will have a lot less. So I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about my perspective. And so my perspective has been, albeit, I'll tell you, a local one. I was a city council member for 7 years in Tacoma. I was the representative on the planning agency in Puget Sound area, representing the city on transportation issues. And I was both a Pierce Transit and a Sound Transit board member. So to say that I'm supportive of transit is an understatement, and I'll say this because it's kind of safe to say it over here. I was the prime sponsor in the House of the Sound Transit 3 proposal. So I do firmly believe that building more roads is not a solution in and of itself. It's part of the solution. But we have to have other corridors in order to make it possible for people to earn a living, to get where they need to get in a reasonable amount of time, and not waste a lot of personal time, family time, stuck on our highways. And so I do have a congestion reduction orientation to my perspective. Now, I also represent a district, and the good senator actually took a tour of a project, a bridge on the Puyallup River, that took the city of Tacoma, I think, about 12 years to rustle up enough money to fix a third of it. And it is Old Highway 99, and it is a freight corridor, and it is, I get the infrastructure part, right? And I get also that, because it's a city-owned bridge, I get that the resources don't exist within a jurisdiction, even jurisdiction the size of Tacoma, to take on a project like this. And I am very concerned, particularly with respect to bridges, but generally with the lack of maintenance that we have in our system and the lack of investment. And I'm committed to making sure that investments, if we do a package, and I'm supportive of doing a package, and I've at least been told by some members of our leadership in the House that they're interested in doing another package, that we do need to address preservation, and we will address preservation, because it only makes sense. I think people unfortunately think that once you build something, whether it's a sports facility or a road or a house or whatever it might happen to be, that your investment is done, and it is not done. We have a failing infrastructure with respect, I'm sure, with respect to water systems. I know that the Tacoma water system is over 100 years old, and that some of that pipe is wood pipe for a water system. So I know that that has to get addressed, and I know that local communities can't handle that on their own. And I've thought about a way that we might be able to sort of bridge, so to speak, for lack of a metaphor, this issue is if we can identify those larger maintenance projects and dedicate specific funds to them within the district, that our members know that they're going to get something at the end of the day, and they're going to get that bridge repaired, so they can talk about a maintenance or a preservation item in the budget that they're supporting the taxes for, as opposed to feeling that they have to have a new bypass or a new corridor built, or whatever it might happen to be. So I think we have an obligation, I think, to, our part of the job is to sell these kinds of investments. And certainly it's a lot easier when we're talking about a new intersection, a new roundabout, a new whatever, a new something that's in a member's district. But we have to do those things. Now I want to talk a little bit about the context that the senator add to the context that the senator set up. Talk about failing infrastructure. We've got, what, a 100-year-old bridge crossing the Columbia River that because of political bickering, or maybe the electricity isn't working either, because of bickering by advocates for and against that project, it missed its turn, so to speak, in the package that we passed. But it doesn't change the situation on the ground, that we've got a bridge that needs to be replaced, and a bridge that could fail, and with, I think, catastrophic consequences to a lot of different economic activity, and to the detriment of anybody that lives in that area or wants to get through that area, through the Portland, Vancouver area. So we have to do a package, I believe, in the near term rather than the later term, because we've got projects. I think you might have a project in your district, a failing infrastructure, a trestle maybe. Yeah. So we have to do some things. We're not done. I think we did a good job. I had the pleasure of negotiating with the good senator and other members of the legislature on both sides. A package that I thought was very good, and we actually, as time went on, we kept adding projects and dollars to individual projects in that. So I'm looking forward to working with you folks to make sure that we do the right thing with preservation. Maybe be a little bit more creative in terms of how we describe things for the benefit of members, and that the obligation that I have is to make this work. And to make it work, I need to be able to sell it to people on both sides of the aisle in my caucus and make sure we've got something acceptable to the Senate and the senator here, because that's how we get things done. But I'm really anxious to listen to questions. I've totally blown off my script, so don't tell anybody. Oh, camera's on. But I don't think I said anything that was inappropriate, did I?
Yeah.
Senator, if all the stars lined up correctly and you put a package on the floor, how long would it take to pass it? 1 year, 2 sessions?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I'm pretty amazing, so maybe that one session, I don't know. Let's see, how long did it take the last one? Like 2 or 3 sessions here, right?
We
Took a while.
went back to 12.
You know, I don't know. It's gonna be tough.
So,
It's not gonna be easy.
So if I could add to that, what I would say is, I'm expecting that I'm gonna have something in the order of 10 new members coming to Olympia. And there's gonna be some new members in the Senate, I hope. So we will have the difficulty of getting people on board, getting them educated. And it is, I think it takes a good term in the legislature for people to feel well enough grounded that they have a shot at being effective as a legislature. You just don't. I know from my own experience the benefits of hydroelectricity, and that it is non-carbon, and that the investments that were made in your system, but other systems throughout the country, really did a lot of benefit to the economic development of many areas of this country, and there was a lot of federal investment in this state and in other states nearby to make that system work. So I would not jump. That would not be the place that I would jump to. I believe that climate change is a much bigger problem than the consequences of some hydroelectric dams. That's just my perspective. Maybe there'll be a point where we're out of the woods on climate. I don't see that happening. And maybe it's a little bit more relevant conversation, but I just think at this point, why would you do that with all the benefits that system provides?
I've been trying to include hydro as a renewable. I've been trying to do incremental hydro as a renewable. I think this will be an ongoing debate that'll happen next session as bills come up to alter 1947, or bills that come up to do the concept of 100% renewable, which has nothing to do with the good roads or here, but I'm sure you're familiar with it, and we'll see what happens next session.
Thank you. Yeah, I mentioned that really in the reliance on other modes should those dams be removed. Daunting, it's a lot of commerce.
We'll hear.
With the numbers you've heard this morning, having seen the numbers from Roger Millard, and I know that Mike has picked up on some of those, and then hearing from the panel of NPOs in the eastern part of Washington, hearing that we already don't have enough money for the maintenance that needs to be done in the current system, what do you need from us to bring this message across? Because this is nothing new. This is just going to get exponentially worse. I do understand the difficulty in trying to pass a transportation package when you don't have a project that somebody can put their name to. But ultimately, this failure in funding current maintenance and preservation needs is affecting all of the regions in the entire state. This is not an east side problem or a west side problem. This is a statewide problem. So what do you need from us, the local RTPOs and MPOs, that help get this message across to legislators when they can't put their name to a project?
So I think one is, as citizens, talk to your legislator. Right? And any ties that you might have to an interest group, whether it be business, that, have them sell it. And labor. I mean, my side of the aisle loves you guys.
you need to go in there and say, we need maintenance and preservation, it's important, because let's face it, legislators are susceptible to interest rates. So you need to get that point across. The other thing is, and I think the new chair of the House Transportation Committee, I think it was a great idea to go, hey, look, instead of like putting a whole bunch of money into maintenance preservation, maybe we call out certain things and going, hey, this road's gonna get paved in your district. That might be I mean, I know you guys probably don't like that because you don't have the flexibility, but maybe we can get our members to actually vote on it and be excited about it. Because I have the trestle, I need to replace the trestle in my district. But when it just got paved recently, and I had so many like positive emails and Facebook posts about it, we were just so happy about it. And if there was that's the way we sell it to some of these members, like, hey, look, this road in your district, it's on the project list, or we'll have to call it something else. It's on the maintenance and preservation list. We have to do both, and I know it's clumsy. It's gonna look ridiculous in some cases.
That's why I suggested it.
Yeah, there you go. So I'll do it, I'll take all the votes, right, for it. But maybe we have a separate one. We have a separate one just for maintenance preservation. And we also give a bunch of money in buckets of maintenance and preservation.
So the story is, we didn't talk about one other topic here where there's gonna be an ask. And that is for some more ferry boats.
Yeah.
So I think you need to ramp your game up and be a voice with the others that are looking for projects that are, whether it's ferries or whether it's a project, whether it's a trestle or whether it's a Columbia River crossing. And so that you're a player, that you're gonna get your share of what you think is needed. Now, the other thing I would say is I get a lot of local government folks come in and asking for projects, not preservation, but projects. So I think part of, for those folks that you work with to get them to spend more time on the preservation needs in that MPO as opposed to that project, that shiny object, because it's the same thing that both elected officials, local officials want that shiny object just like legislators do. So I think there's a message there for the metropolitan planning organizations to talk about preservation in a way that is equal or more important than that project itself.
And I would say we've got some regional directors here of DOT. My advice to you, because I think I'm gonna do this, is come up with your priority list of what roads or whether need to be paved or maintained or whatever. That way, when it comes time to putting this thing together, I can go, okay, this representative or senator does not want to vote for it. Maybe I can pull, road that he or she needs to be paved, or whatever. Just pull that, throw it on the list. I think there's somebody up here.
Yeah, thank you. Now, as long as we touched on hydro, there is a huge relationship between grain to market on the barges and the over-the-road trucks. So I hope we'd all agree that grain is gonna need to get to Portland somehow. And if we shut the dams down, there's 140 trucks per barge that now will be rolling.
There's also the PCC line, which is really critical to the wheat growers in this area, and that needs to be upgraded.
That's
some serious issues.
Right. Well, more efficient modes of transportation, right? Less carbon.
The Congresswoman said at lunch today that when she was a Republican member of the House, that she voted for the 2005 Gas Act, and indicated that there was bipartisanship about transportation in Congress to some extent. Has the traditional view that transportation is a bipartisan issue in the legislature continued, or is it breaking down, or where are we on that?
So it depends on who you have as your ranking and who are the members in whatever particular caucus. Just speaking on the Senate side, I have a great relationship with Curtis King. I have a really good relationship with the Republicans that are on my committee. And it's very productive, and I'm hopeful, and we got the transportation package out of the Senate when it was Republican controlled, and Yeah. And I'm not gonna pass a package without Republican votes. I don't think I can do that. I think it's best when both sides sit together and figure this out, because it really benefits the whole state. Of course, there are gonna be challenges, and this is where those of you who live in the east side of the mountains can convince your Republican legislator to be with me on this transportation package, and those who are tied to business and labor, you're gonna have to help me with the Democrats, because they're not gonna love this either, right? So it's gonna take a twofold effort to get a package through.
So my response is that our last transportation vote on budget was 97-1. And I don't have the same ranking members. I really do like your ranking member. I don't know who will be my ranking member should I be chair at this point. But I found it very easy to work with the prior ranking member, Representative Orcutt, even though he's quite conservative. He and I sponsored legislation for electric vehicle incentives and infrastructure, right? So, that's not usually something that a ranking member probably would do. So, I think it's relationships, right? This is all about relationships, and you have to have people in the positions that have the capability of working relationships, seeing things from the other member's perspective, and trying to make sure that it's a win, not just for the chair, but it's a win for the individual members, that they can say, I had a role, I might not have gotten everything, nobody got everything, but I was heard and I got something.
Have you worn down the room?
Yeah, looks like it.
That's good. What a hard question.
Well, if nobody else has another question, I think we ought to thank the legislators. With 4 minutes to spare. So, thank you so much. We're gonna do a little summary. Welcome to stay, or you may have to go. Has Ben left? Ben? Oh, right. So why don't you come up here with Joe and me, and we're gonna do this little summary, and we'll be done in 15 minutes, there you go. Why don't you start the summary? I'll be right back. Oh my God.
Okay. Okay. Well, as you can well tell, we had a very informative day. Heard from a lot of different aspects of maintenance preservation, which is our emphasis over the next, we all agree, over the next 2 or 3 years, we're gonna, hopefully it won't take that long in order to get additional funding for this. Just in retrospect, the Connecting Washington package, I think that took 2 biennials, I think 4 years, in order to finally come to a conclusion, in order to get it passed.
hopefully it won't take us that long, because we'll be in dire straits on our roads if it takes 4 years to get additional funding. So, we've heard, both on, state prop as well as the local cities and counties. And you heard from all the various funding organizations. There's no new money right now. The only, obviously, 2 years ago, we passed a Connecting Washington, a huge package, but it was, what, out of $16 billion, 15 of it went to capital projects and other things, and only 1.3 billion went to maintenance and preservation on the state system. No additional money went to the local cities and counties. We're gonna have a shortfall. We're building stuff we can't maintain. So, let's see, the funders, both TIB and as well as CRAB, they're asking for additional money. We'll support them in those. They're very effective ways to fund, and it gets it down to the local level. Mike had some revelations on the state system. We're $500 million short per year. So how are we going to maintain that? Because if you don't maintain it, as you saw, we get farther and farther behind. The two legislators, so here, are fairly new in their leadership role in the Senate and the House. Senator Hobbs is just this last year, and Representative Fye is the vice. Judy Cliburn is not rerunning, so you'd assume that he'd be taken over as chair of the House Transportation Committee. I was encouraged. They recognized the need for additional funding, specifically for maintenance and preservation. It's up to us to keep putting that pressure on and making that awareness. And it isn't just to the legislators, it's to the general public also. So we need to design not only good roads, but a lot of the other organizations, cities, counties, ports, and everybody else, is to make the public aware of this shortfall. Because otherwise, we're going to have failing transportation system. Jump in. I think Will did a great job of providing some great pictures, especially like the one where the concrete railing on the side of the bridge fell over. Last week, I was up in out of Port Angeles with the commission, and we went and visited the what's the bridge? Ewha Bridge up there. And we looked down underneath the bridge, and the footings are washed out because it's not sitting on bedrock. And we go, we're not going across that bridge. And it's amazing. It is scheduled to get fixed next year, to rebuild that bridge. But that was something that we actually created by taking out the two dams on the Elwha. So, but those things are gonna come up. We're gonna have crises in our roads and transportation systems. So we've got to have a way in order to fix it and fund it. Well, I gave Mike a little speech. Oh, can I finish with one last thing? Road user charge, you had some discussion about road user charge. I'm chair of the steering committee for the road user charge for the commission. We're studying road user charge. We are coordinating with Oregon and California, which they instituted actual road user charge, and they're still, I didn't agree with the way they did it. Instead of studying it, they implemented it, and it was a disaster. they admitted that. So, but we're studying it, we're going through, we have 2,000 people that are utilizing the road user charge. It's a quasi, you don't actually pay like Oregon. We'll see where the strengths and weaknesses are in it. It is one of the decision points after we're all done of how we treat the 18th Amendment for road user charge. Will seems to think that we're still covered with the original road user charge legislation 75 years ago. Legally, they question it, but we'll have to address that in our finalization on road user charge. Road user charge got high emphasis nationally. And actually, Washington, Oregon, and California are leading the charge. The feds, the highway department allocated $97 million in order to study it. And we were Washington was the largest grant recipient of road user charge study money.
Ben wants to leave here fairly soon to go back to Western Washington, so why don't you go next and give us your little summary?
Yeah, just like to say a few words. As the outgoing president of the Washington State Good Roads and Transportation Association, it's really been my privilege to serve the last year to turn things over to Will at this point. But, you know, I gotta say too, you know, this annual conference, 120th annual conference for the association, you know, I think this was a big success. You know, one of my biggest takeaways from this is this organization, we have so many different kinds of people here. We have labor, business, we have electeds, we have washed out, we have, you know, a very diverse group of people. Okay, and often in the course of my normal employ, I don't get to interact with these people all the time. It's really a privilege to do that here. And, you know, I think this is an asset for us. Just like, you know, our elected guests spoke to us today and what they told us, whether it was from the Congresswoman on the federal level or the state senator and state congressman from Washington. You know, I think we got our marching orders. You know, I think that they give us some direction on what we need to do to get this maintenance and preservation, get it funded, transportation package. We've got a lot of good things to do, and I think this is a great organization to do that. So once again, thanks for a great 120th annual conference. So Will?
I just want to be very brief. I do think we made progress. I want to be very brief, like 3 minutes to get us out a little ahead of time. I think that that candid conversation with the legislators was very useful, and that we ought to learn from what they said. But let me just go through the quick points. That your package there has 12 pictures. Well, 11 pictures and a newspaper article. There are 2 from each of the 6 regions that were provided, and I hope that you will make use of them. You've seen up here, flipping through the last hour, the additional pictures I got from the RAs and all the other regions. And we have visual evidence that supports Roger Millar's statement of the needs that we have. And I think that Ashley Grover and John Coster, and particularly the panel, gave us additional information that's really important to flesh out the fact that we are talking about $1.5 billion to $2 billion a year in underfunding for preservation and maintenance. And we know it has an impact. The first cut by WSGRTA is that it's $656 per car per year, which they established as an equivalent to $1.14 gas tax. And that really does mean, to a certain extent, at the state level, that in order to avoid 15 cents additional gas tax dedicated to preservation and maintenance, we're charging people $656 a year in needless car repairs. And that's something that we can start to translate and help people to understand and quantify this as it impacts their own lives. I hope you'll use these pictures. I hope that you will feel free to distribute them. They're in the public domain. I thought the MPO panel this morning was particularly revealing and really helpful, and I want to thank all of the participants as well as Todd for moderating. It's very important to us as supporters of the 18th Amendment that Senator Hobbs is so strong that a road user charge needs to have that protection. It was interesting to hear from Representative Fye as well, that he's hearing from people, I presume he meant his constituents and others, that this is important to them as well. So I think that gives us something to build on, and that's important because our next meeting is scheduled, as is indicated in the last page of your agenda, for November of next year, the 75th anniversary. We're going to be at the Laborers Hall, so there'll be a lot more guys in orange and women. And I hope that you'll make your reservation early and encourage others to participate as well. I think this idea that both Ashley and Mike had about the need for maintenance for system additions is something that was interesting in terms of what Senator Hobbs said about constitutionally protecting revenues, and then I think he called it cutouts or carve-outs for preservation and maintenance sections. So I think that's something that we definitely need to pursue with them. And if I thought that, and I'm sure that the RA's picked up on it, but I just want to mention it before I forget it, and that is this interesting concept of if you have to have earmarks, and their perception is basically you do in order to get the packages passed in the legislature, that actually the RA's taking a proactive role in identifying what would be popular preservation and maintenance projects in their district and conveying that, I presume, up the chain of command, not directly to the legislators. But that seems to me to be very useful advice in terms of how we may be able to get them. I mean, if they're going to have to earmark, at least make sure that the earmarks include the preservation and maintenance projects that have been being left off. So I just thought the conference was good. Last year we had less than half as many people as we have this year, and I know that in that big union hall over there in Des Moines, that we're going to fill that up next year. So until then, unless somebody says otherwise, we're going to be dismissed.